Chapter 8. Steamer day mixed out in the harbor by the channel entrance. The President Tyler stood motionless as Diamond had, and from his post near the rail outside his stateroom, John Quincy Winterslip took his first look at Honolulu. He had no feeling of having been here before. This was an alien land. Several miles away, he saw the line of piers and unlovely warehouses that marked the waterfront. Beyond that lay a vast expanse of brilliant green, pierced here and there by the top of a modest skyscraper. Back of the city, a range of mountains stood on guard, peaks of crystal blue against the azure sky. A trim little launch from quarantine chugged importantly up to the big liner's side, and a doctor in a khaki uniform ran briskly up the accommodation ladder to the deck not far from where the boy stood. John Quincy wondered at the man's vitality. He felt the spent force himself. The air was moist and heavy, the breeze the ship had stirred in moving gone forever. The flood of energy that had swept over him in San Francisco was but a happy memory now. He leaned wearily on the rail, staring at the bright tropical landscape before him, and not seeing it at all. He saw instead a quiet, well-furnished Boston office, where at this very moment the typewriters were clicking amiably and the stock ticker was busily writing the story of another day. In a few hours, there was a considerable difference of time. The market would close, and the men he knew would be piling into automobiles and heading for the nearest country club. A round of golf, then a calm, perfectly served dinner, and after that, a quiet evening with a book. Life running along as it was meant to go, without rude interruption or disturbing incident. Wife devoid of Ohio wood boxes, attic encounters, unwillingly witnessed love scenes, cousins with blackbirding pasts. Suddenly, John Quincy remembered. This was the morning when he must look Dan Winterslip in the eye and tell him he had been a bit dilatory with his fists. Oh well. He straightened resolutely. The sooner that was done, the better. Harry Jennison came along the deck, smiling and vigorous, clad in spotless white from head to foot. Here we are, he cried, on the threshold of paradise. Think so? Said John Quincy. Know it, Jennison answered. Only place in the world, these islands. You remember what Mark Twain said. Ever visited Boston? John Quincy cut in. Once, replied Jennison briefly. That's Punchbowl Hill, back of the town, and Tantalus beyond. Take you up to the summit someday. Wonderful view. See that tallest building? The Van Patten Trust Company. My office is on the top floor. Only drawback about getting home, I'll have to go to work again. I don't see how anyone can work in this climate, John Quincy said. Oh, well, you take it easy. Can't manage the pace of your mainland people. Every now and then some go-getter from the States comes out here and tries to hustle us. He laughed. He dies of disgust, and we bury him in a leisurely way. Down the breakfast. John Quincy accompanied him to the dining saloon, but Dauber Maynard would be very limited. The old lady's cheeks were flushed, and her eyes sparkled. Barbara, too, was in her gayest mood. The excitement of coming home had made her very happy. Or was her happiness all due to that? John Quincy noted her smile of greeting for Jemison and rather wished he knew less than he did. Prepare for a thrill. John Quincy, the girl said. Landing in Hawaii is like landing nowhere else on the globe. Of course, this is a through boat, and it isn't welcomed as the Matson liners are. But there'll be a crowd waiting for the Matsonia this morning, and we'll steal a little of her aloha. A little of her what? Inquired John Quincy. Aloha, meaning loving welcome. You shall have all my lies, John Quincy. Just to show you how glad Honolulu is, you've come at last. The boy turned to Madame Mamie. I suppose this is an old story to you? Bless ye, my boy, she said. It's always new. 128 times. Yet I'm as thrilled as though I were coming home from college. She sighed. 128 times. So many of those who once hung leaves about my neck are gone forever now. They'll not be waiting for me, not on this dock. None of that, Barbara chided. Only happy thoughts this morning. It's steamer day. Nobody seemed hungry, and breakfast was a sketchy affair. John Quincy returned to his cabin to find Bowker strapping up his luggage. I guess you're all ready, sir, said the steward. I finished that book last night, and you'll find it in your suitcase. We'll be moving on to the dock shortly. All good luck to you, and don't forget about the Akola Howl. It's graven on my memory, smiled John Quincy. Here? This is for you. Bowker glanced at the banknote and pocketed it. You're mighty kind, sir, he remarked feelingly. But that'll sort of balance up the $1 each and I'll get from those 2 missionaries when we reach China, if I'm lucky. Of course, it's rather distasteful to me to accept anything. From a friend of Tim's, you know. Oh, that's for value received, said John Quincy, and followed Bowker on deck. There she is, announced Bowker, pausing by the rail. Honolulu, the South Seas, with a collar on. Driving a Ford car. Polynesia, with a private still, and all the other benefits of the white man's civilization. We'll go at it 8 tonight, thank heaven. Paradise doesn't appeal to you, suggested John Quincy. No, nor any other of these bright-colored lands my poor old feet must tread. I'm getting fed up, sir. He came closer. I want to hang my hat somewhere and leave it there. I want to buy a lot of newspaper in some country town and starve to death on the proceeds of running it. What a happy finish. Well, maybe I can manage it before long. I hope so, said John Quincy. I hope so too, said Bowker. Here's wishing you a happy time in Honolulu. And one other word of warning. Don't linger there. I don't intend to, John Quincy assured him. That's the talk. It's one of those places, dangerous. Lotus on the menu every day. The first thing you know, you forgot where you put your trunk. So long, sir. With a wave of the hand, Tim's friend disappeared down the deck. Amid much confusion, John Quincy took his place in line for the doctor's inspection. Past the careful scrutiny of an immigration official who finally admitted that maybe Boston was in the Union, and was then left to his own devices and his long, long thoughts. The President Tyler was moving slowly toward the shore. Excited figures scurried about her decks, pausing now and then to stare through lifted glasses at the land. John Quincy perceived that early through the hour the pier toward which they were heading was alive with people. Barbara came and stood by his side. "Poor old Dad," she said. "He's been struggling along without me for 9 months. This'll be a big morning in his life. You'll like Dad?" John Quincy. "I'm sure I shall," he answered heartily. "Dad's one of the finest." Jennison joined them. "Harry, I meant to tell the steward to take my luggage ashore when we land." "I told him," Jennison said. "I tipped him too." "Thanks," the girl replied. "I was so excited I forgot." She leaned eagerly over the rail, peering at the dock. Her eyes were shining. "I don't see him yet," she said. They were near enough now to hear the voices of those ashore gay voices, calling flippant greetings. The big ship edged gingerly closer. "There's Aunt Minerva," cried John Quincy suddenly. That little touch of home in the throng was very pleasant. "Is that your father with her?" He indicated a tall, anemic man at Minerva's side. "I don't see where," Barbara began. "Oh, why, that's Uncle Amos." "Oh, is that Amos?" remarked John Quincy, without interest. But Barbara had gripped his arm, and as he turned, he saw a wild alarm in her eyes. "What do you suppose that means?" she cried. "I don't see Dad. I don't see him anywhere." "Oh, he's in that crowd somewhere." No, you don't understand. Uncle Amos. I'm frightened." John Quincy didn't gather what it was all about, and there was no time to find out. Jennison was pushing ahead through the crowd, making a path for Barbara, and the boy meekly brought up the rear. They were among the first down the plank. Miss Minerva and Amos were waiting at the foot. "My dear?" Miss Minerva put her arms about the girl and kissed her gently. She turned to John Quincy. "Well, here you are." There was something lacking in this welcome. John Quincy sensed it at once. "Where's Dad?" Barbara cried. "I'll explain in the car," Miss Minerva began. "No, now. I must know now." The crowd was surging about them, calling happy greetings. The Royal Hawaiian Band was playing a gay tune. Carnival was in the air. "Your father is dead, my dear," said Miss Minerva. John Quincy saw the girl's slim figure sway gently, but it was Harry Jennison's strong arm that caught her. For a moment she stood, with Jennison's arm about her. "All right," she said. "I'm ready to go home," and walked like a true Winterslip toward the street. Amos melted away into the crowd, but Jennison accompanied them to the car. "I'll go out with you," he said to Barbara. She did not seem to hear. The four of them entered the limousine, and in another moment the happy clamor of steamer day was left behind. No one spoke. The curtains of the car were drawn, but a warm streak of sunlight fell across John Quincy's knees. He was a little dazed. Shocking, this news about Cousin Dan. I must have died suddenly, but no doubt that was how things always happened out this way. He glanced at the white-stricken face of the girl beside him, and because of her, his heart was heavy. She laid her cold hand on his. "It's not the welcome I promised you, John Quincy," she said softly. "Why, my hero, I don't matter now." No other word was spoken on the journey, and when they reached Dan's house, Barbara and Miss Minerva went immediately upstairs. Jennison disappeared through a doorway at the left. Evidently, he knew his way about. Haku volunteered to show John Quincy his quarters, so he followed the Jap to the second floor. When his bags were unpacked, John Quincy went downstairs again. Miss Minerva was waiting for him in the living room. From beyond the bamboo curtain leading to the lanai came the sound of men's voices, mumbling and indistinct. "Well," said John Quincy, "how have you been?" "Never better," his aunt assured him. "Mother's been rather worried about you. She'd begun to think you were never coming home." "I've begun to think it myself," Miss Minerva replied. He stared at her. "Some of those bonds you left with me have matured. I haven't known just what you wanted me to do about them." "What," inquired Miss Minerva, "is a bond?" The sort of wild, reckless talk never did make a hit with John Quincy. "It's about time somebody came out here and brought you to your senses," he remarked. "Think so?" said his aunt. A sound upstairs recalled John Quincy to the situation. This was rather sudden, Cousin Dan's death, he inquired. "Amazingly so." "Well, it seems to me that it would be rather an intrusion, our staying on here now. We got exactly home in a few days. I better see about reservations." "You needn't trouble," snapped Miss Minerva. "I'll not stir from here until I see the person who did this brought to justice." "The person who did what?" asked John Quincy. "The person who murdered Cousin Dan," said Miss Minerva. John Quincy's jaw dropped. His face registered a wide variety of emotions. "Good Lord," he gasped. "Oh, you needn't be so shocked," said his aunt. "The Winterslip family will still go on." "Well, I'm not surprised," remarked John Quincy, "when I stop to think the things that I've learned about Cousin Dan. It's a wonder to me." "That will do," said Miss Minerva. "You're talking like Amos, and that's no compliment. You didn't know Dan." "I did, and I liked him. I'm going to stay here and do all I can to help run down the murderer. And so are you." "Pardon me, I am not." "Don't contradict. I intend you shall take an active part in the investigation. The police are rather informal in a small place like this. Good. They'll welcome your help." "My help? I'm no detective. What's happened to you anyhow? Why should you want me to go round hobnobbing with policemen?" "For the simple reason that if we're not careful, some rather unpleasant scandal may come out of this. If you're on the ground, you may be able to avert needless publicity. For Barbara's sake." "No, thank you," said John Quincy. "I'm leaving for Boston in 3 days, and so are you. Pack your trunks." Miss Minerva laughed. "I've heard your father talk like that," she told him. "But I never knew him to gain anything by it. Come out on the lanai, and I'll introduce you to a few policemen." John Quincy received this invitation with the contemptuous silence he thought it deserved. But while he was lavishing on it his best contempt, the bamboo curtain parted, and the policeman came to him. Jennison was with them. "Good morning, Captain Hallett," said Miss Minerva brightly. "May I present my nephew, Mr. John Quincy Winterslip of Boston." "I'm very anxious to meet Mr. John Quincy Winterslip," the captain replied. "How do you do?" said John Quincy. His heart sank. They'd drag him into this affair if they could. "And this, John Quincy," went on Miss Minerva, "is Mr. Charles Chan, of the Honolulu Detective Force." John Quincy had thought himself prepared for anything but Mr. Chan. He gasped. "Mere words," said Chan, "cannot express my unlimitable delight in meeting a representative of the ancient civilization of Boston." Harry Jennison spoke. "This is an appalling business, Miss Winterslip," he said. "As perhaps you know, I was your cousin's lawyer. I was also his friend. Therefore, I hope you won't think I am intruding if I show a keen interest in what is going forward here." "Not at all," Miss Minerva assured him. "We shall need all the help we can get." Captain Hallett had taken a paper from his pocket. He faced John Quincy. "Young man," he began, "I said I wanted to meet you. Last night, Miss Winterslip told me of a cablegram received by the dead man about a week ago, which she said angered him greatly. I happen to have a copy of that message, turned over to me by the cable people. I'll read it to you. John Quincy, sailing on President Tyler, stop, owing to unfortunate accident. He leaves here with empty hands. Signed, Roger Winterslip." "Yes," said John Quincy haughtily. "Explain that, if you will." John Quincy stiffened. "The matter was strictly private," he said. "A family affair." Captain Hallett glared at him. "You're mistaken," he replied. "Nothing that concerns Mr. Dan Winterslip is private now. Tell me what that cable meant, and be quick about it." "Busy this morning." John Quincy glared back. The man didn't seem to realize to whom he was talking. Barty said, "You again." "John Quincy," snapped Miss Minerva. "Do as you're told." "Oh well, if she wanted family secrets aired in public." Reluctantly, John Quincy explained about Dan Winterslip's letter and the misadventure in the attic of Dan's San Francisco house. "An Ohio wood box bound with copper," repeated the captain. "Initials on it, TMB. Got that, Charlie?" "It's written in the book," said Chan. "Any idea what was in that box?" asked Howard. "Not the slightest," John Quincy told him. Hallett turned to Miss Minerva. "And you knew nothing about this?" She assured him he did not. "Well," he continued, "one thing more, and we'll go along. We've been making a thorough search of the premises by daylight, without much success, I'm sorry to say. However, by the cement walk, just outside that door," he pointed to the screen door leading from the living room into the garden, "Charlie made a discovery." Chan stepped forward, holding a small white object in the palm of his hand. "One half cigarette, incompletely consumed," he announced. "Very recent, not weather-stained. It are of the brand denominated Corsican, assembled in London, and smoked habitually by Englishmen." Hallett again addressed Miss Minerva. "Did Dan Winterslip smoke cigarettes?" "He did not," she replied. "Cigars and a pipe, but never cigarettes." You were the only other person living here. I haven't acquired the cigarette habit, snapped Miss Minerva. Though undoubtedly, it's not too late yet. The servants, perhaps, went on Hawlett. Some of the servants may smoke cigarettes, but hardly of this quality. I take it these are not on sale in Honolulu. They're not, said the captain. But Charlie tells me they're put up in airtight tins and shipped to Englishmen the world over. Well, don't stow that away, Charlie. The Chinaman tenderly placed the half-cigarette, incompletely consumed, in his pocketbook. I'm going on down the beach now to have a little talk with Mr. Jin Egan, the captain added. Ellison, I'll go with you, Jennison offered. I may be able to supply a lake or two there. Sure, come along, Hawlett replied cordially. Captain Hawlett, put in Miss Minerva. It is my wish that some member of the family keep in touch with what you are doing in order that we may give you all the aid we can. My nephew would like to accompany you. Pardon me, said John Quincy coldly. You're quite wrong. I have no intention of joining the police force. Well, just as you say, remarked Hawlett. He turned to Miss Minerva. I'm relying on you at any rate. You've got a good mind. Anybody can see that. Thank you, she said. As good as a man's, he added. Oh, now you've spoiled it. Good morning. The three men went through the screen door into the bright sunshine of the garden. John Quincy was aware that he was not in high favor with his aunt. I'll go up and change, he said uncomfortably. We'll talk things over later. He went into the hall. At the foot of the stairs, he paused. From above came a low, heartbreaking moan of anguish. Barbara, poor Barbara, who had been so happy less than an hour ago. John Quincy felt his head go hot, the blood pound in his temples. How dare anyone strike down a Winterslip? Probably. How dare anyone inflict this grief on his cousin Barbara? He clenched his fists and stood for a moment, feeling that he too could kill. Action. He must have action. He rushed through the living room, past the astonished Miss Minerva. In the drive stood a car. The three men were already in it. Wait a minute, called John Quincy. I'm going with you. Hop in, said Captain Howitz. The car rolled down the drive and out onto the hot asphalt of Kalia Road. John Quincy sat erect, his eyes flashing, by the side of a huge grinning Chinaman. Chapter 9. At the Reef and Palm. They reached Kalakaua Avenue, and swerving sharply to the right, Captain Howlett stepped on the gas. Since the car was without a top, John Quincy was getting an unrestricted view of this land that lay at his journey's end. As a small boy, squirming about on the hard pew in the First Unitarian Church, he had heard much of heaven, and his youthful imagination had pictured it as something like this: a warm, rather languid country, freshly painted in the gaudiest colors available. Creamy white clouds wrapped the tops of the distant mountains, and their slopes were bright with tropical foliage. John Quincy heard near at hand the low monotone of breakers lapping the shore. Occasionally, he caught a glimpse of apple-green water and a dazzling white stretch of sand. Oh, Waikiki! Oh, scene of peace. What was the rest of that poem his Aunt Minerva had quoted in her last wedding? the one in which she had announced that she was staying on indefinite, and looking down from tum-tum skies, the angels smile on Waikiki. Sentimental, but sentiment was one of Hawaii's chief exports. One had only to look at the place to understand and forgive. John Quincy had not delayed for a hat, and the sun was beating down fiercely on his brown head. Charlie Chan glanced at him, humbly begging pardon. Remarked the Chinaman, would say it is unadvisable to venture forth without headgear, especially since you are a Fakawan. A what? The term carries no offense. Now a Haini, stranger, newcomer. Oh! John Quincy looked at him curiously. Are you a Billany? Are you a Billany? Not in the least, grinned Chan. I am Kama'aina, old-timer. Pursuing the truth further, I have been 25 years in the islands. They passed a huge hotel, and presently, John Quincy saw Diamond Head standing an impressive guardian at the far end of that lovely curving beach. A little farther along, the captain drew up to the curb, and the four men alighted. On the other side of a dilapidated fence of a garden that might have been Eden at its best. Entering past a gate that hung sorrowfully on one hinge, they walked up a dirt path, and in a moment, a ramshackle old building came into view. They were approaching it on an angle, and John Quincy saw that the greater part of it extended out over the water. The tottering structure was of 2 stories, with double-decked balconies on both sides, and it had a rather an air about it. Once, no doubt, it had been worthy to stand in this setting. Flowering vines clambered over it in a friendly endeavor to hide its imperfections from the world. Someday, announced Charlie Chan solemnly, those rafters underneath will disintegrate, and the Reef and Palm Hotel will descend into the sea with a most horrid gurgle. As they drew nearer, it seemed to John Quincy that the Chinaman's prophecy might come true at any moment. They paused at the foot of a crumbling stair that led to the front door, and as they did so, a man emerged hurriedly from the Reef and Palm. His once white clothes were yellowed, his face lined, his eyes tired and disillusioned. But about him, as about the hotel, hung the suggestion of a distinguished past. Mr. Eden, said Captain Howard properly. Oh, how are you? The man replied, with an accent that recalled to John Quincy's mind his meeting with Captain Arthur Temple Cope. We want to talk to, announced Hallett brusquely. A shadow crossed Egan's face. I'm frightfully sorry, he said, but I have a most important engagement, and I'm late as it is. Some other time. Now, Cut and Hallett. The words shot through the morning like a rocket. He started up the steps. Impossible, said Egan. He did not raise his voice. Nothing on earth could keep me from the dock this morning. The captain of detectives seized his arm. Come inside, he ordered. Egan's face flushed. Take your hand off me. Dammy! By what right? You watch your step, Egan, advised Hallett angrily. You know why I'm here. I do not. Hallett stared into the man's face. Van Winterslip was murdered last night, he said. Jin Egan removed his hat and looked helplessly out toward Kalakaua Avenue. "So I read in the morning paper," he replied. "What has his death to do with me?" "You were the last person to see him alive," Howard answered. "Now, quit bluffing and come inside." Egan cast one final baffled glance at the street, where a trolley bound for the city 3 miles away was rattling swiftly by. Then he bowed his head and led the way into the hotel. They entered a huge, poorly furnished public room, deserted save for a woman tourist writing postcards at a table, and a shabby Japanese clerk lolling behind the desk. "This way," Egan said, and they followed him past the desk and into a small private office. Here, all was confusion. Dusty piles of magazines and newspapers were everywhere. Battered old ledgers lay upon the floor. On the wall hung a portrait of Queen Victoria. Many pictures cut from the London illustrated weeklies were tacked up haphazardly. Jemison spread a newspaper carefully over the windowsill and sat down there. Egan cleared chairs for Howlett Chan and John Quincy, and himself took his place before an ancient roll-top desk. "If you will be brief," Captain he suggested, "I might still have time." He glanced at a clock above the desk. "Forget that," advised Howlett sharply. His manner was considerably different from that he employed in the house of a leading citizen, like Dan Winterslip. "Let's get to business." He turned to Chan. "Got your book, Charlie." "Preparations are complete," replied Chan, his pencil poised. "All right." Howlett drew his chair closer to the desk. "Now, Egan, you come through and come clean. I know that last night, about 7:30, you called up Dan Winterslip and tried to slide out of an appointment you had made with him. I know that he refused to let you off and insisted on seeing you at 11. About that time, you went to his house. You and he had a rather excited talk. At 1:25, Winterslip was found dead." "Murdered, Egan." "Now, give me your end of it." Jin Egan ran his fingers through his curly, close-cropped hair. "Straw-colored once, but now mostly gray." "That's all quite true," he said. "Do you mind if I—" He took out a silver case and removed a cigarette. His hand trembled slightly as he applied the match. "I did make an appointment with Winterslip for last night," he continued. "During the course of the day, I changed my mind. When I called up to tell him so, he insisted on seeing me. He urged me to come at 11, and I went." "Who let you in?" Howlett asked. "Winterslip was waiting in the garden when I came. We went inside." Howlett glanced at the cigarette in Egan's hand. "By the door leading directly into the living room?" he asked. "No," said Egan. "By the big door at the front of the house. Winterslip took me out on his lanai. We had a bit of a chat regarding the business that had brought me. About half an hour later, I came away. When I left, Winterslip was alive and well, in good spirits too, smiling as a matter of fact." "At what door did you leave?" "The front door, the one I'd entered by." "I see." Howlett looked at him thoughtfully for a moment. "You went back later, perhaps?" "I did not," said Egan promptly. "I came directly here and went to bed." "Who saw you?" "No one. My clerk goes off duty at 11. The hotel is open, but there is no one in charge. My patronage is—"
"Not large."
You came here at 11:30 and went to bed, Howard said, but no one saw you. Tell me, were you well acquainted with Dan Winterslip? Egan shook his head. In the 23 years I've been in Honolulu, I had never spoken to him until I called him on the telephone yesterday morning. Howard leaned back in his chair and spoke in a more amiable tone. As a younger man, I believe you traveled a lot? I drifted about a bit, Egan admitted. I was just 18 when I left England. At your family's suggestion, smiled the captain. What's that to you? Egan flared. Where did you go? Australia. I rangered for a time and later I worked in Melbourne. What a doing? Persisted Howard. In a bank. A bank, and then the South Seas. Just wandering about. I was restless. Beachcombing. Egan flushed. I may have been on my uppers at times, but damn it. Wait a minute, Howard. Cut in. What I want to know is, those years you were drifting about, did you, by any chance, run into Dan Winterslip? I might have. What sort of an answer is that? Yes or no? As a matter of fact, I did, Egan admitted. Just once. In Melbourne. But it was a quite unimportant meeting. So unimportant Winterslip had completely forgotten it. But you hadn't. And yesterday morning, after 23 years' silence between you called him on the telephone. On rather sudden business. I did. Howard came closer. All right, Egan. We've reached the important part of your story. What was that business? A tense silence fell in the little office as they awaited Egan's answer. The Englishman looked Howard calmly in the eye. I can't tell you that, he said. Howard's face reddened. Oh, yes, you can. And you're going too? Never, answered Egan, without raising his voice. The captain glared at him. You don't seem to realize your position. I realize it perfectly. If you and I were alone, I won't tell you any circumstances. Howard, maybe you'll tell the prosecutor. Look here, cried Egan wearily. Why must I say it? Over and over. I'll tell nobody my business with Winterslip. Nobody. Understand. He crushed the half-smoked cigarette savagely down onto a tray at his side. John Quincy saw Howard nod to Chan. He saw the Chinaman's pudgy little hand go out and seize the remnant of cigarette. A happy grin spread over the Oriental's fat face. He handed the stub to his chief. Corsican brand, he cried triumphantly. Ah, yes, said Howard. This is your usual smoke? A startled look crossed Egan's tired face. No, it's not, he said. It's a make that's not on sale in the islands, I believe. No, I fancy it isn't. Captain Howard held out his hand. Give me your cigarette case, Egan. The Englishman passed it over, and Howard opened it. He said. You've managed to get hold of a few, haven't you? Yes, they were given me. Is that so? Who gave them to you? Egan considered. I'm afraid I can't tell you that either, he said. Howard's eyes glittered angrily. Let me give you a few facts, he began. You called on Dan Winterslip last night. You entered and left by the front door, and you didn't go back. But just outside the door, leading directly into the living room, we have found a partly smoked cigarette of this unusual brand. No, will you tell me who gave you these Corsicans? No, said Egan, I won't. Howlett slipped the silver cigarette case into his pocket and stood up. Very well, he remarked. I've wasted all the time I intend to here. The district court prosecutor will want to talk to you. Of course, agreed Egan. I'll come and see him this afternoon. Howlett glared at him. Quit kidding yourself. And get your hat. Egan rose too. Look here, he cried. I don't like your manner. It's true, there are certain matters in connection with Winterslip I can't discuss. And that's unfortunate. But surely you don't think I killed the man. What motive would I have? Jennison rose quickly from his seat on the window ledge and stepped forward. Howard, he said, there's something I ought to tell you. 2 or 3 years ago, Dan Winterslip and I were walking along King Street, and we passed Mr. Egan here. Winterslip nodded toward him. I'm afraid of that man, Harry, he said. I waited to hear more, but he didn't go on, and he wasn't the sort of client one would prompt. I'm afraid of that man, Harry. Just that, and nothing further. It's enough, remarked Howlett grimly. Begin. You're going with me. Egan's eyes flashed. Of course, he cried bitterly. Of course I'm going with you. You're all against me. The whole town is against me. I've been sneered at and belittled for 20 years. Because I was poor. An outcast, my daughter humiliated, not good enough to associate with these New England blue bloods, these thin-lipped Puritans with a touch of sun. At sound of that familiar phrase, John Quincy sat up. Oh yes, I'm real concerned. Never mind that, Howlett was saying. I'll give you one last chance. Will you tell me what I want to know? Cried Edith. Pray. Then come along. Am I under arrest? Asked Egan. I didn't say that, replied Howlett, suddenly cautious. The investigation is young yet. You are withholding much-needed information, and I believe that after you've spent a few hours at the station, you'll change your mind and talk. In fact, I'm sure of it. I haven't any warrant, but your position will be a lot more dignified if you come willingly without one. Egan considered a moment. I fancy you're right, he said. I have certain orders to give the servants, if you don't mind. Howlett nodded. Make it snappy. Charlie will go with you. Egan and the Chinaman disappeared. The captain, John Quincy, and Jennison went out and sat down in the public room. 5 minutes passed. 10. 15. Jennison glanced at his watch. See here, Howlett, he said. The man's making a monkey of you. Howlett reddened and stood up. At that instant, Egan and Chan came down the big open stairway at one side of the room. Howlett went up to the Englishman. Say, Egan, what are you doing? Playing for time. Egan smiled. That's precisely what I'm doing, he replied. My daughter's coming in this morning on the Natsonia. The boat ought to be at the dock now. She's been at school on the mainland, and I haven't seen her for 9 months. You've done me out of the pleasure of meeting her, but in a few minutes. Nothing doing, cried Howard. Now you get your hat. Unpow. Egan hesitated a moment, then slowly took his battered old straw hat from the desk. The 5 men walked through the blooming garden toward Howard's car. As they emerged into the street, a taxi drew up to the curb. Egan ran forward, and the girl John Quincy had last seen at the gateway to San Francisco leaped out into the Englishman's arms. "Dad, where were you?" she cried. "Carrie, darling," he said, "I was so frightfully sorry. I meant to be at the dock, but I was detained. How are you, my dear?" "I'm fine, Dad, but where are you going?" She looked at Hallett. John Quincy remained discreetly in the background. I've a little business in the city, like Egan said. I'll be home presently. I fancy. If I shouldn't be, I leave you in charge." "Why, Dad?" "Don't worry," he added pleadingly. "That's all I can say now." "Don't worry, my dear." He turned to Howard. "Shall we go, Captain?" The 2 policemen, Dennison and Egan, entered the car. "John Quincy, step forward." The girl's big perplexed eyes met his. "You?" she cried. "Coming, Mr. Winterslip?" inquired Howard. John Quincy smiled at the girl. "You were quite right," he said. "I haven't needed that hat." She looked up at him. "But you're not wearing any at all." "That's hardly wise, Mr. Winterslip," barked Howard. John Quincy turned. "Oh, pardon me, Captain," he said. "I forgot to mention it, but I'm leaving you here. Goodbye." Howard grunted and started his car, while the girl paid for her taxi out of a tiny purse. John Quincy picked up her suitcase. This time he said, "I insist on carrying it." They stepped through the gateway into the garden that might have been Eden on one of its better days. "You didn't tell me we might meet in Honolulu," the boy remarked. "I wasn't sure we would." She glanced at the shabby old hotel. "You see, I'm not exactly a social favorite out here." John Quincy could think of no reply, and they mounted the crumbling steps. The public room was quite deserted. "And why have we met?" the girl continued, and fearfully puzzled. What was Dad's business with those men? One of them was Captain Howard, a policeman. John Quincy frowned. "I'm not so sure your father wants you to know. But I've got to know. That's obvious. Please tell me." John Quincy relinquished the suitcase and brought forward a chair. The girl sat down. "It's this way," he began. "My cousin Dan was murdered in the night." Her eyes were tragic. "Oh, poor Barbara," she cried. "That's right. You mustn't forget Barbara." "But Dad..." "Oh, go on, please." "Your father visited Cousin Dan last night at 11, and he refuses to say why. There isn't other things he refuses to tell." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with sudden tears. "I was so happy on the boat," she said. "I knew it couldn't last." He sat down. "Nonsense. Everything will come out. All right. Your father is probably shielding someone." She nodded. "Of course. But if he's made up his mind not to talk, he just simply won't talk. He's odd that way. They may keep him down there, and I shall be all alone." "Not quite alone," John Quincy told her. No, she said. I warned you. We're not the sort the best people care to know. The more fools they, cut in the boy. I'm John Quincy Winterslip of Boston. And you, Carlota, Maria Egan. She answered. See, my mother was half Portuguese. The other half is Scotch-Irish. My father's English. This is the melting pot out here, you know. She was silent for a moment. My mother was very beautiful. She added wistfully. So I mean, they tell me I never knew. John Quincy was touched. I thought how beautiful she must have been, he said gently. That day, I met you on the ferry. The girl dabbed at her eyes with an absurd little handkerchief and stood up. Well, she remarked, this is just another thing that has to be faced. Another call for courage. I must meet it. She smiled. The lady manager of the Reef and Palm. Can I show you a room? I say, it'll be a rather stiff job, won't it? John Quincy rose too. Oh, I shan't mind. I've helped Dad before. Only one thing troubles me. Bills and all that. I've no head for arithmetic. That's all right. I have replied, John Quincy. He stopped. Wasn't he getting in a little deep? How wonderful, the girl said. Why, not at all. John Quincy protested. It's my line. At home. Home. Yes, he had a home. He recalled. Arms and interest and all that sort of thing. I'll drop in later in the day to see how you're getting on. He moved away in a mild panic. I'd better be going now, he added. Of course. She followed him to the door. And become. You're altogether too kind. Shall you be in Honolulu long? That depends, Tom Quincy said. I've made up my mind to one thing. I shan't stir from here until this mystery about Cousin Dan is solved. And I'm going to do everything in my power to help in solving it. I'm sure you're very clever too, she told him. He shook his head. I wouldn't say that, but I intend to make the effort of my life. I've got a lot of incentives for seeing this affair through. Something else trembled on his tongue. Better not say it. Oh, Lord, he was saying it. You're one of them, he added, and clattered down the stairs. Do be careful, called the girl. Those steps are even worse than they were when I left. Just another thing to be repaired someday. When our ship comes in. He left her smiling wistfully in the doorway and hurrying through the garden, stepped out on Kalakaua Avenue. The blazing sun beat down on his defenseless head. Gorgeous trees flaunted scarlet banners along his path. Tall coconut palms swayed above him at the touch of the friendly trades. Not far away, rainbow-tinted waters lapped a snowy beach. A sweet land. All of that. Did he wish that Agatha Parker were there to see it with him? Pursuing the truth further, as Charlie Chan would put it, he did not. Chapter 10. A newspaper wrecked in anger. When John Quincy got back to the living room, he found Miss Minerva pacing up and down with the light of battle in her eyes. He selected a large, comfortable-looking chair and sank into it. Anything the matter? He inquired. You seem disturbed. I've just been having a lot of pilikia, she announced. What's that? Another native drink? What? He said with interest. Could I have some? Too. Pilikia means trouble. She translated. Several reporters have been here. and you'd hardly credit the questions they asked. About Cousin Dan. John Quincy nodded. I can imagine. However, they got nothing out of me. I took good care of that. Go easy, advised John Quincy. A fellow back home who had a divorce case in his family was telling me that if you're not polite to the newspaper boys, they just plain break your heart. Don't worry, said Miss Minerva. I was diplomatic, of course. I think I handled them rather well under the circumstances. They were the first reporters I'd ever met, though I've had the pleasure of talking with gentlemen from the transcript. What happened at the Reef and Palm Hotel? John Quincy told her in part, Oh, I shouldn't be surprised if Egan turned out to be guilty, she commented. I've made a few inquiries about him this morning, and he doesn't appear to amount to much. A sort of glorified beachcomber. Nonsense, objected John Quincy. Egan's a gentleman. Just because he doesn't happen to have prospered is no reason for condemning him without a hearing. He's had a hearing, snapped Miss Minerva. And it seems he's been mixed up in something he's not precisely proud of. Oh, there, I've gone and ended a sentence with a preposition. Probably all this has upset me more than I realize. John Quincy smiled. Cousin Dan, he reminded her, was also mixed up in a few affairs he could hardly have looked back on with pride. No, Aunt Minerva, I feel Howard is on the wrong trail there. It's just as Egan's daughter said. She glanced at him quickly. Oh, so Egan has a daughter. Yes, and a mighty attractive girl. It's a confounded shame to put this thing on her. Said Miss Minerva. John Quincy glanced at his watch. Good Lord, it's only 10 o'clock. A great calm had settled over the house. There was no sound save the soft lapping of waves on the beach outside. What in heaven's name do you do out here? Oh, you'll become accustomed to it shortly, Miss Minerva answered. At first you just sit and think. After a time, you just sit. Sounds fascinating, said John Quincy, sarcastically. That's the odd part of it, his aunt replied. It is. One of the things you think about at first is going home. That naturally slips your mind. We gathered that, John Quincy told her. You'll meet a man on the beach, said Miss Minerva, who stopped over between boats to have his laundry done. That was 20 years ago, and he's still here. Probably they haven't finished his laundry, suggested John Quincy, yawning openly. I'm going up to my room to change, and after that, I believe I'll write a few letters. He rose with an effort and went to the door. How's Barbara? He asked if Miss Minerva shook her head. Dan was all the poor child had, she said. She's taken it rather hard. You won't see her for some time, and when you do, the least said about all this, the better. Why, naturally, agreed John Quincy, and went upstairs. After he had bathed and put on his whitest, thinnest clothes, he explored the desk that stood near his bed and found it well supplied with notepaper. Languidly, laying out a sheet, he began to write. Here I am in Honolulu, and outside my window I can hear the lazy swish of waters lapping the famous beach of Lazy Indeed. John Quincy had a feeling for words. He stopped and stared at an agile little cloud flitting swiftly through the sky, got up from his chair to watch it disappear over Diamond Head. On his way back to the desk, he had to pass the bed. What inviting duds they had out here. He lifted the mosquito netting and dropped down for a moment. Haku hammered on the door at 1 o'clock, and that was how John Quincy happened to be present at lunch. His aunt was already at the table when he staggered in. Cheer up, she smiled. You'll become acclimated soon. Of course, even then, you'll want your nap just after lunch every day. I will not, he answered, but there was no conviction in his tone. Barbara asked me to tell you how sorry she is not to be with you. She's a sweet girl, John Quincy. She's all of that. Give her my love, won't you? Your love. His aunt looked at him. Didn't you mean that? Barbara's only a second cousin. He laughed. Don't waste your time matchmaking, Aunt Minerva. Someone has already spoken for Barbara. Really? Who? Jennison. He seems like a fine fellow, too. Handsome, at any rate, Miss Minerva admitted. They ate in silence for a time. The coroner and his friends were here this morning, said Miss Minerva presently. That's so, replied John Quincy. Any verdict? Not yet. I believe they're to settle on that later. By the way, I'm going downtown immediately after lunch to do some shopping for Barbara. Care to come along? No thanks, John Quincy said. I must go upstairs and finish my letters. But when he left the luncheon table, he decided the letters could wait. He took a heavy volume with a South Sea title from Dan's library and went out onto the lanai. Presently, Miss Minerva appeared, smartly dressed in white linen. I'll return as soon as I'm Pa, she announced. What is this, Pa? John Quincy inquired. Pow means finished. Through. Good Lord, John Quincy said. Aren't there enough words in the English language for you? Oh, I don't know, she answered. A little Hawaiian, sprinkled in, makes a pleasant change. And when one reaches my age, John Quincy, one is eager for a change. Goodbye. She left him to his book and the somnolent atmosphere of Dan's lanai. Sometimes he read colorful tales of other islands farther south. Sometimes he sat and thought. Sometimes he just sat. The blazing afternoon wore on. Presently, the beach beyond Dan's garden was gay with bathers, sunburned men and girls, pretty girls in brief and alluring costumes. Their cries as they dared the surf were exultant, happy. John Quincy was keen to try these notable waters, but it didn't seem quite the thing. Not just yet. With Dan Winterslip lying in that room upstairs. Miss Minerva reappeared about 5, flushed, and though she well knew it was not the thing for one of us standing in the back bed, perspiring. She carried an evening paper in her hand. Any news? Inquired John Quincy. She sat down. Nothing but the coroner's verdict. The usual thing, person or persons unknown. Person. But as I was reading the paper in the car, I had a sudden inspiration. Good for you. What was it? Hako appeared at the door leading to the living room. You ring, miss? He said, Aige. Haku. What becomes of the old newspapers in this house? Take and put in a closet beside kitchen, the man told her. See if you can find me.
No, never mind.
So, I'll look myself. She followed Haku into the living room. In a few minutes, she returned alone, a newspaper in her hand. "I have it," she announced triumphantly. The evening paper of Monday, June 16th, the one Dan was reading the night he wrote that letter to Roger. "And look, John Quincy, one corner has been torn from the shipping page." "Might have been accidental," suggested John Quincy languidly. "Nonsense," she said sharply. "It's a clue. That's what it is. The item that disturbed Dan was on that missing corner of the page." "Might have been at that," he admitted. "What are you going to do?" "You're the one that's going to do it," she cut in. "Pull yourself together and go into town. It's 2 hours until dinner. Give this paper to Captain Howlett, or better still, to Charlie Chan." "I am impressed by Mr. Chan's intelligence." John Quincy laughed. "Damned clever, these Chinese," he quoted. "You don't mean to say you've fallen for that bunk?" "They seem clever because they're so different." "We'll see about that." "The chauffeur's gone on an errand for Barbara, but there's a roadster in the garage." "Charlie's good enough for me," said John Quincy. "Here, give me the paper." She explained to him how he was to reach the city, and he got his hat and went. Presently, he was on a trolley car surrounded by representatives of a dozen different races. The melting pot of the Pacific, Carlota Eben had called Honolulu, and the appellation seemed to be correct. John Quincy began to feel a fresh energy, a new interest in. The trolley swept over the low swampy land between Waikiki and Honolulu, past rice fields where quaint figures toiled patiently in water to then meet, past taro patches, and finally turned on to King Street. Every few moments it paused to take aboard new immigration problems. Japs, Chinamen, Hawaiians, Portuguese, Filipinos, Koreans, all colors and all creeds. On it went. John Quincy saw great houses set in blooming groves, a Japanese theater flaunting weird posters, not far from a Ford service station, and a huge building he recognized as the Palace of the Monarchy. Finally, it entered a district of modern office buildings. Mr. Kipling was wrong. The boy reflected. East and West could meet. They had. This impression was confirmed when he left the car at 4th Street and for a moment walked about, a stranger in a strange land. A dusky policeman was directing traffic on the corner. Officers of the United States Army and Navy in spotless duck strolled by. And on the shady side of the street, Chinese girls, slim and immaculate, in freshly laundered trousers and jackets, were window shopping in the cool of the evening. "I'm looking for the police station," John Quincy informed a big American with a friendly face. "Get back on to King Street, for man's sake. Go to your right until you come to Bethel, then turn McCut. Turn left." The man smiled. "La bienvenue, Neil Saint, you take it. Mackay means toward the sea. The other direction is Mauka, toward the mountains. The police station is at the foot of Bethel, in Kalakahale." John Quincy thanked him and went on his way. He passed the post office and was amazed to see that all the lockboxes opened on the street. After a time, he reached the station. A sergeant lounging behind the desk told him that Charlie Chan was at dinner. He suggested the Alexander Young Hotel, or possibly the All-American Restaurant on King Street. The hotel sounded easiest, so John Quincy went there first. In the dim lobby, A Chinese houseboy wandered aimlessly about with broom and dustpan. A few guests were writing the inevitable postcards. A Chinese clerk was on duty at the desk. But there was no sign of Chan, either in the lobby or in the dining room at the left. As John Quincy turned from an inspection of the ladder, the elevator door opened, and a Britisher in mufti came hurriedly forth. He was followed by a Cockney servant carrying luggage. Captain Cope called John Quincy. The captain paused. "Hello," he said. "Oh, Mr. Winterslip, how are you?" He turned to the servant. "Buy me an evening paper and an armful of the less offensive-looking matter." The man hurried off, and Cope again addressed John Quincy. "Delighted to see you, but I'm in a frightful rush. Off to the Fanning Islands, in 20 minutes." "When did you get in?" inquired John Quincy. Not that he really cared. "Yesterday at noon," said Captain Cope. "Been on the wing ever since. I trust you are enjoying your stop here, but I was forgetting. Fearful news about Dan Winterslip." "Yes," said John Quincy calmly. Judging by the conversation in that San Francisco club, the blow had not been a severe one for Captain Cope. The servant returned. "Sorry to run," continued the captain, "but I must be off. The service is a stern taskmaster. My regards to your aunt. Best of luck, my boy." He disappeared through the wide door, followed by his man. John Quincy reached the street in time to see him rolling off in a big car toward the docks. Noting the cable office nearby, the boy entered and sent 2 messages, one to his mother and the other to Agatha Parker. He addressed them to Boston, Mass, USA, and was accorded a withering look by the young woman in charge as she crossed out the last 3 letters. There were only 2 words in each message, but he returned to the street with the comfortable feeling that his correspondence was now attended to for some time to come. A few moments later, he encountered the All-American restaurant and, going inside, found himself the only American in the place. Charlie Chan was seated alone at a table, and as John Quincy approached, he rose and bowed. "A very great honor," said the Chinaman. "Is it possible that I can prevail upon you to accept some of this terrible provision?" "No, thanks," answered John Quincy. "I'm to dine later at the house. I'll sit down for a moment if I may." Quite overwhelmed, Bob Charlie, he resumed his seat and scowled at something on the plate before him. "Waiter," he said, "be kind enough to summon the proprietor of this establishment." The proprietor, a suave little Jap, came gliding. He bowed from the waist. "Is it that you serve here in sanitary food?" inquired Chan. "Please deign state your complaint," said the Jap. "This piece of pie are covered with finger marks," rebuked Chan. "The sight are most disgusting. Kindly remove it and bring me a more hygienic sector." The Jap picked up the offending pastry and carried it away. "Japanese," remarked Chan, spreading his hands in an eloquent gesture. "Is it proper for me to infer that you come on business connected with the homicide?" John Quincy smiled. "I do," he said. He took the newspaper from his pocket, pointed out the date, and the missing corner. "My aunt felt it might be important," he explained. "The woman has a brain," said Chan. "I will procure an unmutilated specimen of this issue and compare." The import may be vast.
You know, remarked John Quincy, I'd like to work with you on this case, if you'll let me.
I have only delight, Chan answered. You arrive from Boston, a city most cultivated, where much more English words are put to employment than are accustomed here. I thrill when you speak. Greatest privilege for me, I would say. Have you formed any theory about the crime? John Quincy asked. Chan shook his head. Too early now. You have no fingerprints to go on, you said. Chan shrugged his shoulders. Does not matter. Fingerprints and other mechanics, good in books, in real life, not so much so. My experience tell me to think deep about human people. Human passions. Back of murder what? Always. Hate, revenge, need to make silent the slain one. Greed for money, maybe. Study human people at all times. Sounds reasonable, admitted John Quincy. Mostly so, Chan averred. Enumerate with me the clues we must consider. A guest book devoid of one page. A glove button. A message on the cable. Story of Egan partly told. Fragment of Corsican cigarette. This newspaper ripped maybe in anger. Watch on, living wrist, numeral 2 on distinct. Quite a little collection, commented John Quincy. Most interesting, admitted the Chinaman. One by one, we explore. Some cause us to arrive at nowhere. One, maybe two, will not be so unkind. I am believer in Scotland method. Follow only essential clue. But enter not the method here. I must follow the essential clue, repeated John Quincy. Sure. Chan scowled at the waiter, for his more hygienic sector had not appeared. Too early to say here, but I have fondness for the guest book, with page omitted. Watch also claims my attention. Odd enough, when we enumerate clues this morning, we pass over watch. Foolish. Very good-looking clue. One large fault. We do not possess it. However, my eyes are sharp to apprehend it. I understand, John Quincy said, that you've been rather successful as a detective. Chan grinned broadly. You are educated, maybe you know, he said. Chinese, most psychic people in the world. Sensitives like film and camera. A look, a laugh, a gesture perhaps. Something go click. John Quincy was aware of a sudden disturbance at the door of the All-American restaurant. Balker, the steward, gloriously drunk, was making a noisy entrance. He plunged into the room, followed by a dark, anxious-looking youth. Embarrassed, John Quincy turned away his face, but to no avail. Balker was bearing down upon him, waving his arms. Well, 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 well. He bellowed. My old college chum. See you through the window. He leaned heavily on the table. How you been, old fellow? I'm all right. Thanks, John Quincy said. The dark, young man came up. He was, from his dress, a sure acquaintance of Balker's. Look here, Ted, he said. You've got to be getting along. Just a minute, cried Balker. I want you to meet Mr. Quincy from Boston. One best fellows God ever made. Mutual friend O. Tim's. You've heard me speak of Tim. He has come along, urged the dark young man. Not yet. Gotta buy this boy a little drink? What you having, Quincy? Oh man. Not a thing, smiled John Quincy. You warned me against these island drinks yourself. Who? Me. Bowker was hurt. You're wrong that time, oh man. Don't like to conturn something. But
it must have been somebody else.
not me. Never said a word. The young man took his arm. Come on. You're due on the ship. Bowker wrenched away. Don't paw me, he cried. Keep your hands off. I'm my own master, ain't I? I can speak to an oaf friend. Can't I? Now, Quincy, oh man, what's yours? I'm sorry, said John Quincy. Some other time. Bowker's companion took his arm in a firmer grasp. You can't buy anything here, he said. This is a restaurant. You come with me. I know a place. All right, agreed Bowker. Now you're talking. Quincy, oh man, you come along. Some other time, John Quincy repeated. Bowker assumed a look of offended dignity. Just as you say, he replied. Some other time. In Boston, right? At Tim's place. Only Tim's place is gone. A great grief assailed him. Tim's gone dropped out, as though the earth swallowed him up. Yes, yes, said the young man, soothingly. That's too bad. But you come with me. Submitting at last, Bowker permitted his companion to pilot him to the street. John Quincy looked across at Chan. My steward on the President Tyler, he explained. The worse for wear, isn't he? The waiter set a fresh piece of pie before the Chinaman. Ah, remarked Chan, this has a more perfect appearance. He tasted it. Appearance, he added with a grimace, are a hellish liar. If you are quite ready to depart, in the street, Chan halted. Excuse abrupt departure, he said. Most honored to work with you. The results will be fascinating, I am sure. For now, good evening. John Quincy was alone again in that strange town. A sudden homesickness engulfed him. Walking along, he came to a news cart that was as well supplied with literature as his club reading room. A brisk young man in a cap was in charge of the latest Atlantic and inquired, John Quincy. The young man put a dark brown periodical into his hand. No, said John Quincy. This is the June issue. I've seen it. July ain't in. I'll save you one, if you say so. I wish you would. John Quincy replied. The name is Winterslip. He went on to the corner, regretting that July wasn't in. A copy of the Atlantic would have been a sort of link with home, a reminder that Boston still stood. And he felt the need of a link, a reminder. A trolley car, marked Waikiki, was approaching. John Quincy hailed it and hopped aboard. 3 giggling Japanese girls in bright kimonos drew in their tiny sandaled feet, and he slipped past them to a seat. Chapter 11. Betray of Jewels. 2 hours later, John Quincy rose from the table where he and his aunt had dined together. Just to show you how quick I am to learn a new language, he remarked, I'm quite Paul. Now, I'm going Nakai to sit on the lanai, there to forget, the Kalisha of the day. Miss Minerva smiled and rose too. "I expect Amos shortly," she said as they crossed the hall. A family conference seemed advisable, so I've asked him to come over. "Strange you had to send for him," said John Quincy, lighting a cigarette. "Not at all," she answered. She explained about the long feud between the brothers. "Didn't think old Amos had that much fire in him," commented John Quincy as they found chairs on the lanai. A rather anemic specimen, judging by the look I had at him this morning. But then, the Winterslips always were good haters. For a moment, they sat in silence. Outside, the darkness was deepening rapidly. The tropic darkness that had brought tragedy the night before. John Quincy pointed to a small lizard on the screen. "Pleasant little beast," he said. "Oh, they're quite harmless," Miss Minerva told him. "And they eat the mosquitoes." "They do, eh?" The bully slacked his ankle savagely. "Well, there's no accounting for tastes." Amos arrived presently, looking unusually pale in the half-light. "You asked me to come over, Minerva," he said, as he sat down gingerly on one of Dan Winterslip's Hong Kong chairs. "I did. Smoke, if you like." Amos lighted a cigarette, which seemed oddly out of place between his thin lips. "Unsure," Miss Minerva continued, "that we are all determined to bring to justice the person who did this ghastly thing." "Naturally," said Amos. "The only drawback," she went on, "is that in the course of the investigation, some rather unpleasant facts about Dan's past are likely to be revealed." "They're bound to be," remarked Amos coldly. "For Barbara's sake," Miss Minerva said, "I'm intent on seeing that nothing is revealed that is not absolutely essential to the discovery of the murderer. For that reason, I haven't taken the police completely into my confidence." "What?" cried Amos. John Quincy stood up. "Now look here, Aunt Minerva." "Sit down," snapped his aunt. "Amos, to go back to a talk we had at your house when I was there, Dan was somewhat involved with this woman down the beach. Arlene Compton. The relief she calls herself." Amos nodded. "Yes, and a worthless lot she is. But Dan wouldn't see it, though I understand his friends pointed it out to him. He talked of marrying her. You knew a good deal about Dan, even if you never spoke to him." Miss Minerva went on. "Just what was his status with this woman at the time of his murder? Only last night, but it seems ages ago." "I can't quite tell you," but Amos replied. "I do know that for the past month, a conmanini named Leatherby, the black sheep of a good family in Philadelphia, they tell me, has been hanging around the Compton woman, and that Dan resented his presence." "Oh." Miss Minerva handed to Amos an old brooch, a tree of jewels against an onyx background. "Ever see that before, Amos?" He took it and nodded. "It's part of a little collection of jewelry Dan brought back from the South Seas in the 80s. There were earrings and a bracelet, too. He acted rather queerly about those trinkets, never let Barbara's mother or any kind of one else wear them. But he must have got over that idea recently, for I saw this only a few weeks ago." "Where?" asked Miss Minerva. "Our office has the renting of the cottage down the beach, occupied at present by the Compton woman. She came in not long ago to pay her rent, and she was wearing this brooch." He looked suddenly At Miss Minerva.
Where did you get it?
He demanded. Kamikali gave it to me early this morning, Miss Minerva explained. She picked it up from the floor of the lanai before the police came. John Quincy leaped to his feet. You're all wrong, Aunt Minerva, he cried. You can't do this sort of thing. You ask the help of the police, and you aren't on the level with them. I'm ashamed of you. Please wait a moment, said his aunt. Wait nothing, he answered. Give me that brooch. I'm going to turn it over to Chan at once. I couldn't look him in the eye if I didn't. We'll turn it over to Chan,
said Miss Minerva calmly, if it seems important.
But there is no reason in the world why we should not investigate a bit ourselves before we do so. The woman may have a perfectly logical explanation. Interrupted John Quincy. The trouble with you is, you think you're Sherlock Holmes. So what is your opinion, Amos? Inquired Miss Minerva. I'm inclined to agree with John Quincy, Amos said. You are hardly fair to Captain Howard. And as for keeping anything dark on account of Barbara, or on anybody's account, that won't be possible, I'm afraid. No getting round it. Minerva, Dan's indiscretions are going to be dragged into the open at last. She caught the note of satisfaction in his tone and was nettled by it. Perhaps, at the same time, it isn't going to do any harm for some member of the family to have a talk with this woman before we consult the police. If she should have a perfectly sincere and genuine explanation. Oh, yes, cut John Quincy. She wouldn't have any other kind. It won't be so much what she says, persisted Miss Minerva. It will be the manner in which she says it. Any intelligent person can see through deceit and falsehood. The only question is, which of us is the intelligent person best fitted to examine her? Count me out, said Amos promptly. John Quincy? The boy considered. He had asked for the privilege of working with Chan, and here, perhaps, was an opportunity to win the Chinaman's respect. But this sounded rather like a woman who would be too much for him. No, thanks, he said. Very good, replied Miss Minerva, rising. I'll go myself. Oh no, cried John Quincy, shocked. Why not? If none of the men in the family are up to it. As a matter of fact, I welcome the opportunity. Amos shook his head. She'll twist you round her little finger, he predicted. Miss Minerva smiled grimly. I should like to see her do it. Will you wait here? John Quincy went over and took the brooch from Amos's hand. Sit down, Aunt Minerva, he said. I'll see this woman, but I warn you that immediately afterward I shall send for Chan. That, his aunt told him, will be decided at another conference. I'm not so sure, John Quincy, that you are the proper person to go. After all, what experience have you had with women of this type? John Quincy was offended. He was a man, and he felt that he could meet and outwit a woman of any type. He said as much. Amos described the woman's house as a small cottage several hundred yards down the beach, and directed the boy how to get there. John Quincy set out. Night had fallen over the island when he reached Kalia Road, a bright silvery night, for the Kona weather was over and the moon traveled a cloudless sky. The scent of plumeria and ginger stole out to him through hedges of flaming hibiscus. The trade winds blowing across 1,000 miles of warm water, still managed a cool touch on his cheek as he approached what he judged must be the neighborhood of the woman's house. A flock of Indian mina birds in a spreading algaroba screamed loudly, their harsh voices the only note of discord in that peaceful scene. He had some difficulty locating the cottage, which was almost completely hidden under masses of flowering alamander, its blossoms pale yellow in the moonlight. Before the door, a dark, fragrant spot under a heavily laden trellis, he paused uncertainly. A rather delicate errand this was. But he summoned his courage, then knocked. Only the mina birds replied. John Quincy stood there, growing momentarily more hostile to the widow of Waikiki. Some huge, coarse creature, no doubt a man's woman. A good fellow at a party, that kind. Then the door opened, and the boy got a shock, for the figure, outlined against the light, was young and slender, and the face, dimly seen, suggested fragile loveliness. "Is this Mrs. Compton?" he inquired. "Yeah, I'm Mrs. Compton." "What do you want?" John Quincy was sorry she had spoken, for she was obviously one of those beauties so prevalent nowadays, the sort whose speech betrays. Her voice recalled the mina birds. "My name is John Quincy Winterslip." He saw her start. "May I speak with you for a moment?" "Sure you can. Come in." She led the way along a low, narrow passage into a tiny living room. A pasty-faced young man with stooped shoulders stood by a table, fondling a cocktail shaker. "Steve," said the woman, "this is Mr. Winterslip." "Mr. Leatherby." Mr. Leatherby grunted. Just in time for a little snifter, he remarked. "No thanks," John Quincy said. He saw Mrs. Compton take a smoking cigarette from an ashtray, start to convey it to her lips, then, evidently thinking better of it, crush it on the tray. "Well," said Mr. Leatherby, "your poison's ready, Arlene." He proffered a glass. She shook her head, slightly annoyed. "No." "No?" Mr. Leatherby grinned. "The more for a little Stevie." He lifted a glass. "Here's looking at you, Mr. Winterslip. Say, I guess you're Dan's cousin from Boston," Mrs. Compton remarked. "He was telling me about you." She lowered her voice. "I've been meaning to get over to your place all day, but it was such a shock it knocked me flat." "I understand," John Quincy replied. He glanced at Mr. Leatherby, who seemed not to have heard of prohibition. "My business with you, Mrs. Compton, is private." Leatherby stiffened belligerently, but the women said, "That's all right." "Steve was just going." Steve hesitated a moment, then went. His hostess accompanied him. John Quincy heard the low monotone of their voices in the distance. There was a combined odor of gin and cheap perfume in the air. The boy wondered what his mother would say if she could see him now. A door slammed, and the woman returned. "Well?" she said. John Quincy perceived that her eyes were hard and knowing, like her voice. He waited for her to sit down, then took a chair facing her. "You knew my cousin Dan rather intimately," he suggested. "I was engaged to him," she answered. John Quincy glanced at her left hand. He hadn't come across, and he hadn't given me a ring. But it was, understood between us. Then his death is a good deal of a blow to you. She managed a baby stare full of pathos. I'll say it is. Mr. Winterslip was kind to me. He believed in me and trusted me. A lone woman, way out here, don't get any too much charkiness. When did you see Mr. Winterslip last?
3 or 4 days ago. Last Friday evening, I guess it was.
John Quincy frowned. Wasn't that rather a long stretch? She nodded. I'll tell you the truth. We had a little misunderstanding. Just a lover's quarrel. You know? Dan sort of objected to Steve hanging around. Not that he'd any reason to. Steve's nothing to me. Just a weak kid I used to know when I was trooping. I was on the stage, maybe you heard that? Yes, said John Quincy. John Quincy. John Quincy. Yes. You hadn't seen Mr. Winterslip since last Friday. You didn't go to his house last evening? I should say not. I got my reputation to think of. You've no idea how people talk in a place like this. John Quincy laid the brooch down upon the table. It sparkled in the lamplight. A reading lamp, though the atmosphere was not in the least literary. The baby stare was startled now. You recognize that, don't you? He asked. Why, yes. It's one. Just stick to the truth, said John Quincy. Not unkindly. It's an old piece of jewelry that Mr. Winterslip gave you. Well, you've been seen wearing it, you know? Yes, you did give it to me, she admitted. The only present I ever got from him. I guess from the look of it, Mrs. Noah wore it on the ark. Kind of pretty, though. You didn't visit Mr. Winterslip last night, persisted John Quincy. Yet strangely enough, this brooch was found on the floor not far from his dead body. She drew in her breath sharply. Say, what are you? A cop? She asked. Hardly. John Quincy smiled. I am here simply to save you, if possible, from the hands of the cops. If you have any real explanation of this matter, it may not be necessary to call it to the attention of the police. Oh, she smiled. So that's decent of you. Now I will tell you the truth. That about not seeing Dan Winterslip since Friday was bunk. I saw him last night. You did? Where? Right here. Mr. Winterslip gave me that thing about a month ago. 2 weeks ago, he came to me in a sort of excited way and said he must have it back. It was the only thing that he ever gave me when I liked it, and those emeralds are valuable. So, while I stalled a while, I said I was having a new clasp put on it. He kept asking for it. And last night he showed up here, said he just had to have it. Said he'd buy me anything in the stores in place of it. I must say, he was pretty head up. So I finally turned it over to him, and he took it and went away. What time was that? About 9:30. He was happy and pleasant, and he said I could go to a jewelry store this morning and take my pick of the stock. She looked pleadingly at John Quincy. That's the last I ever saw of him. It's the truth, so help me. A wonder mused John Quincy. She moved nearer. Say, you're a nice kid, she said. The kind I used to meet in Boston when we played there. The kind that's got some consideration for a woman. You ain't gonna drag me into this. Think what it would mean to me. John Quincy did not speak. He saw there were tears in her eyes. "You've probably heard things about me," she went on, "but they ain't true. You don't know what I've been up against out here. An unprotected woman don't have much chance anywhere. But on this beach, where men come drifting in from all over the world, I've been friendly. That's my only trouble. I was homesick, and oh God, wasn't I homesick? I was having a good time back there, and then I fell for Bill Compton and came out here with him. And sometimes in the night, I'd wake up and remember Broadway was 5,000 miles away, and I'd cry so hard I'd wake him. And that made him sore." He paused. John Quincy was impressed by the note of true nostalgia in her voice. He was, suddenly, rather sorry for her. "Then Bill's plane crashed on Diamond Head," she continued, "and I was all alone. And these black sheep along the beach, they knew I was alone and broke. And I was homesick for 42nd Street, for the old boarding house and the old gang and the automat and the chewing gum sign and tryouts at New Haven. So I gave a few parties just to forget, and people began to talk." "You might have gone back," John Quincy suggested. "I know. Why didn't I? I've been intending to right along. But every day out here is just like any other day, and somehow you don't get round to picking one out. I've been drifting, but honest to God, if you keep me out of this, I'll go home on the first boat. I'll get me a job, and if you'll only keep me out of it, you got a chance now to wreck my life. It's all up to you, but I know you ain't going to." She seized John Quincy's hand in both of hers and gazed at him pleadingly through her tears. It was the most uncomfortable moment of his life. He looked wildly about the little room, so different from any in the house on Beacon Street. He pulled his hand away. "I'll see," he said, rising hastily. "I'll think it over. But I can't sleep tonight if I don't know," she told him. "I'll have to think it over," he repeated. He turned toward the table in time to see the woman's slim hand reach out and seize the bit of jewelry. "I'll take the brooch," he added. She looked up at him. Suddenly John Quincy knew that she'd been acting, that his emotions had been falsely played upon, and he felt again that hot rush of blood to the head, that quick surge of anger he had experienced in Dame Winterslip's hall. Aunt Minerva had predicted he couldn't handle a woman of this type. "Oh, he'd show the world. Give me that brooch," he said coldly. "It's mine," answered the woman stubbornly. John Quincy wasted no words. He seized the woman's wrist. She screamed. A door opened behind them. "What's going on here?" inquired Mr. Leatherby. "Oh, I thought you'd left us," said John Quincy. "Steve!" "Don't let him have it," cried the woman. Steve moved militantly nearer, but there was a trace of caution in his attitude. John Quincy laughed. "You stay where you are, Steve," he advised, "or I'll smash that sallow face of yours. Strange talk for a Winterslip. Your friend here is trying to hang on to an important bit of evidence in the murder up the beach, and with the utmost reluctance, I am forced to use strong-arm methods." The brooch dropped to the floor. He stooped and picked it up. "Well, I guess that's about all," he added. "I'm sorry if you've been homesick, Mrs. Compton, but speaking as a Bostonian, I don't believe Broadway is as glamorous as you picture it. Distance has lent enchantment. Good night. He let himself out and found his way to Kalakaua Avenue. He had settled one thing to his own satisfaction. Chan must know about the brooch, and at once. Mrs. Compton's story might be true, or not. It certainly needed further investigation by some responsible person. John Quincy had approached the cottage by way of Kalia Road. He was planning to return to Gann's house along the better lighted avenue, having reached that broad expanse of asphalt. However, he realized that the Reef and Palm Hotel was near at hand. There was his promise to Carlotta Egan. He had said he would look in on her again today. As for Chan, he could telephone the Chinaman from the hotel. He turned in the direction of the Reef and Palm. Stumbling through the dark garden, he saw finally the gaunt old hulk of the hotel. Lights of low candle power burned at infrequent intervals on the double-deck veranda. In the huge lobby, a few rather shabby-looking guests took their ease. Behind the desk stood nobody but the Japanese clerk. John Quincy was directed to a telephone booth, and his keen Bostonian mind required Nipponese aid in mastering the dial system favored by the Honolulu Telephone Company. At length, he got the police station. Chan was out, but the answering voice promised that he would be told to get in touch with Mr. Winterslip immediately on his return. "How much do I owe you?" inquired John Quincy of the clerk. "Not a penny," said a voice, and he turned to find Carlotta Egan at his elbow. He smiled. This was more like it. "But I say, I used your telephone." "It's free," she said. "Too many things are free out here. That's why we don't get rich. It was so kind of you to come again." "Not at all," he protested. He looked about the room. "Your father," she glanced at the clerk, and led the way out to the lanai at the side. They went to the far end of it, where they could see the light on Diamond Head and the silvery waters of the Pacific sweeping in to disappear at last beneath the old reef and palm. "I'm afraid poor Dad's having a bad time of it," she said, and her voice broke slightly. "I haven't been able to see him. They're holding him down there. As a witness, I believe. There was some talk of bail, but I didn't listen. We haven't any money, at least I didn't think we had." "You didn't think," he began, puzzled. She produced a small bit of paper and put it in his hand. "I want to ask your advice. I've been cleaning up Dad's office, and just before you came, I ran across that in his desk." John Quincy stared down at the little pink slip she had given him. By the light of one of the small lamps, he saw that it was a check for $5,000, made out to bearer and signed by Dan Winterslip. The date was that of the day before. "I say, that looks important, doesn't it?" John Quincy said. He handed it back to her and thought a moment. "By gad, it is important. It seems to me it's pretty conclusive evidence of your father's innocence. If he had that, his business with Cousin Dan must have come to a successful end, and it isn't likely he would do away with the man who signed it and complicate the case." The girl's eyes shone. "Just the way I reasoned. But I don't know what to do with it. Your father has engaged a lawyer, of course." "Yes, but a rather poor one. The only kind we can afford. Should I turn this over to him?" "Now wait a minute. Any chance of seeing your father soon?" "Yes. It's been arranged I'm to visit him in the morning." John Quincy nodded. Better talk with him before you do anything, he advised. He had a set-in recollection of Egan's face when he refused to explain his business with Dan Winterslip. Take this check with you and ask your father what he wants done with it. Point out to him that it's vital evidence in his favor. Yes, I guess that's the best plan, the girl agreed. Will you sit down a moment? Well, John Quincy recalled Miss Minerva waiting impatiently for news. Just a moment. I want to know how you're getting on. Any big arithmetical problems come up yet? She shook her head. Not yet. It really isn't so bad. The work. We haven't many guests. I could be quite happy if it weren't for poor Dad. She sighed. Ever since I can remember, she added, my happiness has had an if in it. He led her on to speak about herself there in the calm night by that romantic beach. Through her talk flashed little pictures of her motherless childhood on this exotic shore, of a wearing fight against poverty, and her father's bitter struggle to send her to school on the mainland, to give her what he considered her proper place in the world. Here was a girl far different from any he had met on Beacon Street, and John Quincy found pleasure in her talk. Finally, he forced himself to leave. As they walked along the balcony, they encountered one of the guests, a meek little man with stooped shoulders. Even at that late hour, he wore a bathing suit. Any luck? Mr. Saladin? The girl inquired. Lucketh against me. He lisped and passed hastily on. Carlotta Egan laughed softly. Oh, I really shouldn't. She repented at once. The poor man. What's his trouble? Asked John Quincy. He's a tourist, a businessman, she said. Des Moines or someplace like that. And he's had the most appalling accident. He's lost his teeth. His teeth! Repeated John Quincy. Yes. Like so many things in this world, they were false. He got into a battle with a roller out by the second raft, and they disappeared. Since then, he spends all of his time out there, peering down into the water by day, and diving down and feeling about by night. One of the tragic figures of history, she added. John Quincy laughed. That's the most tragic part of it, the girl continued. He's the joke of the beach, but he goes on hunting. So serious. Of course it is serious for him. They passed through the public room to the front door. Mr. Saladin's tragedy slipped at once from John Quincy's mind. Good night, he said. Don't forget about the check when you see your father tomorrow. I'll look in on you during the day. It was so good of you to come, she said. Her hand was in his. It has helped me along tremendously. Don't you worry. Happy days are not far off. Happy days without an if. Hold the thought. I'll hold it, she promised. We'll both hold it. It came to him that he was also holding her hand. He dropped it hastily. Good night, he repeated, and fled through the garden. In the living room of Dan's house, he was surprised to find Miss Minerva and Charlie Chan sitting together, solemnly staring at each other. Jan rose hurriedly at his entrance. Hello, said John Quincy. I see you have a caller. Where in the world have you been? Snapped Miss Minerva. Evidently entertaining a Chinaman had got a bit on her nerves. Well,
John Quincy hesitated.
speak out, said Miss Minerva. Mr. Chan knows everything. Most flattering, grinned Chan. Some things are not entirely well known to me. But about your call on Widow of Waikiki, I learned. Soon after, Dorr receives you. The devil you did, said John Quincy. Simple enough, Chan went on. Study human people. As I relate to you. Compton Lady was friend to Mr. Dan Winterslip. Mr. Leatherby, rival, friend. Enter jealous feelings. Since morning, both of these people are under watchful regard of Honolulu police. Before into the scene, you walk. I am notified and fly to beach.
Does he also know, began John Quincy.
About the brooch? Finished Miss Minerva. Yes, I've confessed everything, and he's been kind enough to forgive me. But not nice thing to do, added Chan. Humbly begging pardon to mention. It's all cards, sugar pose on table when police are called upon. Yes, said Miss Minerva, he forgave me, but I have been gently chided. I'm been made to feel, as he puts it, most naughty. Bowed Chan. Well, as a matter of fact, said John Quincy, I was going to tell Mr. Chan the whole story at once. He turned to the Chinaman. I've already tried to reach you by telephone at the station. When I left the woman's cottage, police affairs forbid utmost courtesy, interrupted Chan. I cut in to remark from the beginning. If you will, please do so. Oh, yes, smiled John Quincy. Well, the woman herself let me in and showed me into her little living room. When I got there, this fellow, Leatherby, was mixing cocktails by the table. Haku appeared at the door. Mr. Charlie Chan, wanted by telephone. He announced. Chan apologized and hastened out. I intend to tell everything, John Quincy warned his aunt. I shan't interfere, she answered. That slant-eyed Chinaman has been sitting here looking at me more in sorrow than in anger for the better part of an hour, and I've made up my mind to one thing. I shall have no more secrets from the police. Chan re-entered the room. As I was saying, John Quincy began. This fellow Leatherby was standing by the table, and... Most sorry, said Chan, but the remainder of that interesting recital is to be told at the station house. At the station house, cried John Quincy. Precisely the fact. I am presuming you do me the great honor to come with me to that spot. The man Leatherby is apprehended aboard boat Niagara, on verge of sailing to Australia. Women are also apprehended in act of tearful farewell. Both now relax at police station. I thought so, said John Quincy. One more amazing fact comes into light, added Chan. In pocket of Leatherby are the page ruthlessly extracted from guest book. Kindly procure the hat. Outside, I have waiting for me one Ford automobile. Chapter 12. Tom Braid the Blackbirder. In Howard's saloon at headquarters, they found the captain of detectives seated grimly behind his desk, staring at two reluctant visitors. But one of the visitors, Mr. Stephen Leatherby, stared back with a look of sullen defiance. Mrs. Arlene Compton, late of Broadway and the Automate, was dabbing at her eyes with a tiny handkerchief. John Quincy perceived that she had carelessly allowed tears to play havoc with her makeup. "Hello, Charlie," said Hallett. "Mr. Winterslip, I'm glad you came along. As you may have heard, we've just pulled this young man off the Niagara. He seemed inclined to leave us. We found this in his pocket." He put into the Chinaman's hand a time, yellowed page, obviously, from Dan Winterslip's guest book. John Quincy and Chan bent over it together. The inscription was written in an old-fashioned hand, and the ink was fading fast. It ran, "In Hawaii all things are perfect, none more so than the hospitality I have enjoyed in this house. Joseph E. Gleason, 124 Little Burke Street, Melbourne, Victoria." John Quincy turned away, shocked. No wonder that page had been ripped out. Evidently, Mr. Gleason had not enjoyed the privilege of studying A.S. Hill's book on the principles of rhetoric. How could one thing be more perfect than another? "Before I take a statement from these people," Howard was saying, "what's all this about a brooch?" John Quincy laid the piece of jewelry on the captain's desk. He explained that it had been given Mrs. Compton by Dan Winterslip, and told of its being discovered on the floor of the Winai. "When was it found?" demanded McCaptain, glaring his disapproval. "Most regrettable misunderstanding," put in Chen hastily. Now completely wiped out. The littlest said sooner repairs are made. "Mr. Winterslip has already tonight examined this woman." "Oh, he has he?" Howard turned angrily on John Quincy. "Just who is conducting this case?" "Well," began John Quincy uncomfortably, "it seemed best to the family. Damn the family." Howard exploded. "This affair is in my hands, please," broke in Chan soothingly. "Waste of time to winnow that out. Already I have boldness to offer suitable rebukes." "Well, you talk with the woman then," said Howard. "What did you get out of her?" "Say, listen," put in Mrs. Compton. "I want to take back anything I told this bright-eyed boy." "Lied to him, eh?" said Howard. "Why not?" "What right did he have to question me?" Her voice became wheedling. "I wouldn't lie to a cop," she added. "You bet your life you wouldn't," Howard remarked. "Not if you know what's good for you. However, I want to hear what you told this amateur detective. Sometimes lies are significant. Go on, Winterslip." John Quincy was deeply annoyed. What was this mix-up he had let himself in for, anyhow? He had a notion to rise, and with a cold bull, leave the room. Something told him, however, that he couldn't get away with it. Very much on his dignity, he repeated the woman's story to him. Winterslip had come to her cottage the night before to make a final appeal for the brooch. On his promise to replace it with something else, she had given it up. He had taken it and left her at 9:30. That was the last she saw of him. Finished John Quincy. Howlett smiled grimly. "So she told you at any rate. But she admits she was lying. If you'd had the sense to leave this sort of thing to the proper people." He wheeled on the woman. "You were lying, weren't you?" She nodded nonchalantly. "In a way. Dan did leave my cottage at 9:30. Or a little later. but I went with him to his house. Ugh, it was perfectly proper. Steve went along.
Oh, yes. Steve.
Hallett glanced at Mr. Leatherby, who did not appear quite the ideal chaperone. Now, young woman, go back to the beginning. Nothing but the truth. So help me, said Mrs. Compton. She attempted a devastating smile. I wouldn't lie to you, Captain. You know I wouldn't. I realize you're a big man out here, and give me your story, cut in Hallett coldly. Sure. Dan dropped into my place for a chat last night about 9, and he found Mr. Leatherby there. He was jealous as sin. Dan was. Honest to God, I don't know why. Me and Steve are just pals. Pals, that's all, said Steve. But anyhow, Dan flew off the handle, and we had one grand blow-up. I tried to explain Steve was just stopping over on his way to Australia, and Dan wants to know what's detaining him. So Steve tells about how he lost all his money at bridge on the boat coming out here. Will you move on? Says Dan. If I pay your passage. And Steve answers he will, like a shot. Am I getting this straight, Steve? Absolutely. Approved. Mr. Leatherby. It's just as she says, Captain. Winterslip offered to loan me passage money. It was only a loan, and I agreed to sail on the Niagara tonight. He said he had a little cash in his safe at the house, and invited Arlene and me to go back with him, which we did, said Arlene. Dan opened the safe and took out a roll of bills. He peeled off $300. You didn't often see him in that frame of mind, but as I was saying, he gave the money to Steve. Then Steve begins to beef a little. Yes, you did, Steve, and wants to know what he's going to do in Australia. Says he don't know a soul down there, and he'll just plain starve. Dan was sore at first, then he laughs a nasty little laugh and goes over and tears that there page out of the guest book and gives it to Steve. Look him up and tell him you're a friend of mine, he says. Maybe he'll give you a job. The name is Gleesay. I've disliked him for 20 years, though he don't know that. A dirty dig at me, Leatherby explained. I took the loan and this Gleason's address, and we started to go. Winterslip said he wanted to talk to Arlene, so I came away alone. That was about 10 o'clock. Where did you go? Howard asked. I went back to my hotel downtown. I had to pack. Back to your hotel, eh? Can you prove it? Leatherby considered. I don't know. The boy at the desk may remember when I came in. Though I didn't stop there for my key. I had it with me. Anyhow, I didn't see Winterslip after that. I just went ahead with my preparations to sail on the Niagara, and I must say you've got your nerve. Never mind that. Howard turned to the woman. And after Leatherby left, what happened then? Well, Dan started in on that brooch again, she said. It made me sore, too. I never did like a tightwad. Besides, my nerves was all on edge. I'm funny that way. Rose get me all upset. I like everybody pleasant around me. He went on arguing, so finally I ripped off the brooch and threw it at him, and it rolled away under the table somewhere. Then he said he was sorry, and that was when he offered to replace it with something more up-to-date. The best money could buy. That was what he promised. Pretty soon we was friends again, just as good friends as ever when I came away, about 10:15. His last words was that we'd look round the jewelry stores this morning. I ask you, Captain, is it reasonable to think I'd have anything to do with murdering a man who was in a buying mood like that? Hawlett laughed. So you left him at 10:15 and went home alone? I did. And when I saw him last, he was alive and well. I'll swear to that. On a stack of Bibles as high as the Times building. Gee, don't I wish I was safe on Broadway tonight? Hawlett thought for a moment. Well, we'll look into all this. You can both go. I'm not going to hold you at present, but I expect you both to remain in Honolulu until this affair is cleared up, and I advise you not to try any funny business. You've seen tonight what chance you've got to get away. Oh, that's all right. The woman stood, looking her relief. We've got no reason to beat it, have we, Steve? None in the world, agreed Steve. His facetious manner returned. Speaking for myself, he added, innocent is my middle name. Good night, all, said Mrs. Compton, and they went out. Hawlett sat staring at the brooch. A pretty straight story, he remarked, looking at Chan. Nice and neat, grinned the Chinaman. If true. Hawlett shrugged his shoulders. Well, for the present, I'm willing to believe it. He turned to John Quincy. Now, Mr. Winterslip, he said severely, I want it understood that any other evidence your family digs up. Oh, that's all right, interrupted the boy. We'll turn it over at once. I've already given to Chan the newspaper my cousin was reading that night. He wrote the letter to Roger Winterslip. Chan took the paper from his pocket. Such a busy evening, he explained. The journal was obscure in my mind. Thanks for the recollection. He called to his chief's attention the mutilated corner. And to look into that, said Hawlett. Before sleeping, promised Chan. Mr. Winterslip, we pursue similar paths. The honor of your company in my humble vehicle would pleasure me deeply. Once in the car, on the deserted street, the Chinaman spoke again. The page ripped from guest book, the brooch lying silent on floor. Both are now followed into presence of a movable stone wall. We sway about, looking for other path. Then you think those two are telling the truth? John Quincy asked. As to that, I do not venture to remark, John replied. How about those psychic powers? Inquired John Quincy. Chan smiled. Psychic powers, somewhat drowsy just now, he admitted. Need prodding into wakefulness. Look here, said John Quincy. There's no need for you to take me out to Waikiki. Just drop me on King Street, and I'll get a trolley. Making a humble suggestion, Chan replied. Is it not possible you will accompany me to newspaper rooms, where we set out on different paths? John Quincy looked at his watch. It was 10 minutes past 11. I'll be glad to, Charlie, he said. Chan beamed with pleasure. Greatly honored by your friendly manner, he remarked. He turned into a side street. Newspaper of this nature burst out at evening. Very quiet now. Somebody may loiter in rooms, if we have happy luck. They had just that, for the building of the evening journal was open, and in the city room, an elderly man with a green shade over his eyes hammered on a typewriter. Hello, Charlie, he said cordially. Hello, Pete. Mr. Winterslip of Boston. I have all the honor to present this. Pete Mayberry. For many years, he explored waterfront ferreting for whatever news are hiding there. The elderly man rose and removed his eye shade, revealing a pleasant twinkle, and he was evidently interested to meet a Winterslip. We pursue, continued Chan, one copy of paper marked June 16, present year. If you have no inclination for objecting. Mayberry laughed. Go to it, Charlie. You know where the files are. Chan bowed and disappeared. Your first appearance out here, Mr. Affert? Winterslip? Inquired the newspaper man. John Quincy, not. I've only just got here, he said. But I can see it's a rather intriguing place. You said it, smiled Mayberry. 46 years ago, I came out from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to visit relatives. I've been in the newspaper game here ever since, most of the time on the waterfront. There's a life work for you. You must have seen some changes, remarked John Quincy, inanely. Mayberry nodded. For the worse, I knew Honolulu and the glamorous days of its isolation, and I've watched it fade into an eighth carbon copy of Babbittville, USA. The waterfront's just a waterfront now. But once, my boy, once it oozed romance at every pore. Chan returned, carrying a paper. Much to be thankful for, he said to Mayberry. Your kindness are quite overwhelming. Anything doing? Asked Mayberry eagerly. Chan shook his head. Presently speaking, no. Our motions just now must be blackly clouded in secrecy. Well, said the reporter, when it comes time to roll them clouds away, don't forget me. Impossibility, protested Chair. Good night. There left Mayberry bending over his typewriter, and at Chan's suggestion went to the All-American restaurant, where the Chinaman ordered 2 cups of your unspeakable coffee. While they waited to be served, he spread out on the table his complete copy of the newspaper, and laying the torn page on its counterpart, carefully removed the upper right-hand corner. The missing fragment, he explained. For a time he studied it thoughtfully, and finally shook his head. I apprehend nothing to startle, he admitted. He handed it across the table. If you will condescend greatly. John Quincy took the bit of newspaper. On one side was a New York advertisement of a Japanese dealer in shirtings who wrote his own publicity. Anyone might carry off, he said, 6 yards for the price of 5. And in case the buyer cried loudly in amaze, how can do? It was a matter he was happy to explain. John Quincy laughed aloud. Ah, said Chan, you are by rights smithful. Kikichi, purveyor of shirting cloth, seize on grand English language and make it into idiotic jumble. On that side are nothing to detain us. That humbly hint in you reversed the fragment. John Quincy reversed it. The other side was a part of the shipping page. He read it carefully. News of sailings and arrivals. There would be places for 5 passengers to the Orient on the Shinio Maru. Leaving Wednesday, the Wilhelmina was 640 miles east of John Quincy's start. A small item in tiny print had met his eye. Among the passengers who will arrive here on the Sonoma from Australia a week from Saturday are Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Macon Braid of Calcutta. His mind went back to the deck of the President Tyler, to a lean old missionary telling the tale of a bright morning on Appian, a grave under a palm tree. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas McCann Braid of Calcutta. He heard again the missionary's high-pitched voice. A callous brute, a pirate and adventurer, Tom Braid, the blackbirder. But Braid had been buried in a long pine box on Appian. Even at the crossroads of the Pacific, his path and that of Dan Winterslip could hardly have crossed again. The waiter brought the coffee. Chan said nothing, watching John Quincy closely. Finally, the Chinaman spoke. "You have much to tell me." John Quincy looked around quickly. He had forgotten Chan's presence. His dilemma was acute. Must he here in this soiled restaurant in a far town reveal to a Chinaman that ancient blot on the Winterslip name? What would Minerva say? Well, only a short time ago, she had remarked that she was resolved to have no more secrets from the police. However, there was family pride. John Quincy's eye fell on the Japanese waiter. What were those lines from the Mikado? But family pride must be denied and mortified and set aside. The boy smiled. "Yes, Charlie," he admitted. "I have much to tell you." And over the unspeakable coffee of the All-American restaurant, he repeated to the detective the story the Reverend Frank Upton had told on the President Tyler. Chan beamed. "Now," he cried, "we arrive in the neighborhood of something. Braid, the blackbirder, mastermaid of Shiloh boat on which Mr. Dan Winterslip, our first officer. But Braid was buried on Appian," protested John Quincy. "Yes, indeed." "And who saw him? Pardon me. Was it then an unsealed box?" "Oh, no." Chan's eyes were dancing. "Please recollect something more. The strong box of Ohio wood. Initials on it are TMD. Mysteries yet, but we move. We advance." "Just, I guess we do," admitted John Quincy. "This much we grasp," Chan continued. Dan Winterslip reposed for quiet hour on Lanai in peaceful reading. This news assaults his eye. He now leaps up, paces about, flees to dock to send letter requesting. "Please, the Ohio word box must be buried deep in Pacific." "Why?" Fumbling in his pocket, Chan took out a sheaf of papers, evidently lists of steamer arrivals. "On Saturday just gone by, the Sonoma made this port. Among passengers, yes. Thomas McCon Braid, an honorable life, Calcutta. It is here inscribed they arrived to stay, not being present when Sonoma persist on journey. On the night of Monday, Mr. Dan Winterslip are foully slain, which makes Mr. Braid an important person to locate," said John Quincy. "How very true. But the hurry are not intense. No boat sailing now. Before sleeping, I will investigate downtown hotels. Waikiki tomorrow. Where are you, Mr. Braid?" Chan sees the check. "No, pardon me. The honor of paying for this poison-tasting beverage must be mine." Out in the street, he indicated an approaching trolley. "It bears imprint of your destination," he pointed out. "You will require sleep. We meet tomorrow. Congratulations on most fruitful evening." Once more, John Quincy was on a Waikiki car. Weary but thrilled, he took out his pipe and, filling it, lighted up. What a day! He seemed to have lived a lifetime since he landed that very morning. He perceived that his smoke was blowing, in the face of a tired little Japanese woman beside him. "Pardon me," he remarked, and knocking the pipe against the side rail, put it in his pocket. The woman stared at him in meek, startled wonder. No one had ever asked her pardon before. On the seat behind John Quincy, a group of Hawaiian boys with yellow leaves about their necks twanged on steel guitars and sang a plaintive love song. The trolley rattled on through the fragrant night. Above the clatter of the wheels, the music rose with a sweet intensity. John Quincy leaned back and closed his eyes. A clock struck the hour of midnight. Another day, Wednesday. It flashed through his mind that today his firm in Boston would offer that preferred stock for the shoe people in Lynn. Would the issue be oversubscribed? No matter. Here he was, out in the middle of the Pacific, on a trolley car. Behind him, brown-skinned boys were singing a melancholy love song of long ago, and the moon was shining on crimson poinciana trees. And somewhere on this tiny island, a man named Thomas McCann Braid slept under a mosquito netting. Or lay awake, perhaps, thinking of Dan Winterslip. Chapter 13. Luggage in Room 19. John Quincy emerged from sleep the next morning with a great effort and dragged his watch from under the pillow. 8:30. Good Lord, he was due at the office at 9. A quick bath and shave. A brief pause at the breakfast table. A run past the public gardens and the common and down to School Street. He sat up in bed. Why was he imprisoned? Under mosquito netting. What was the meaning of the little lizard that sported idly outside the cloth? Oh yes.
Honolulu.
He was in Hawaii and would never reach his office by 9. It was 5,000 miles away. The low murmur of breakers on the beach confirmed him in this discovery, and stepping to his window, he gazed out at the calm, sparkling morning. Yes, he was in Honolulu, entangled in a murder mystery, consorting with Chinese detectives and Waikiki widows following clues. The new day held interesting promise. He must hurry to find what it would bring forth. Haku informed him that his aunt and Barbara had already breakfasted and set before him a reddish sort of cantaloupe, which was, he explained in answer to this question, a papaya. When he had eaten, John Quincy went out on the lanai. Barbara stood there, staring at the beach. A new Barbara, with the old vivacity, the old joy of living, submerged. A pale girl with sorrow in her eyes. John Quincy put his arm about her shoulder. She was a Winterslip, and the family was the family. Again, he felt in his heart that flare of anger against the, quote, person or persons unknown who had brought this grief upon her. The guilty must pay, egan or whoever, Braid or Leatherby, or the chorus girl.
They, and pay dearly. He was resolved on that.
My dear girl, he began. What can I say to you? You said it all. Without speaking, she answered. See, John Quincy, this is my beach. When I was only 5, I swam alone to that first float. He was so proud of me. It's a lovely spot, Barbara, he told her. I knew you'd think so. One of these days, we'll swim together out to the reef, and I'll teach you to ride a surfboard. I want your visit to be a happy one. He shook his head. It can't be that, he said, because of you. But because of you, I'm mighty glad I came. She pressed his hand. I'm going out to sit by the water. Will you come? The bamboo curtain parted, and Miss Minerva joined them. Well, John Quincy, she said sharply, this is a pretty hour for you to appear. If you're going to rescue me from Lotus Land, you'll have to be immune yourself. He smiled. Just getting acclimated, he explained. I'll follow you in a moment, Barbara, he added, and held open the door for her. I waited up, Miss Minerva began, when the girl had gone, until 11:30. But I'd had very little sleep the night before, and that was my limit. I make no secret of it. I'm very curious to know what happened at the police station. He repeated to her the story told by Mrs. Compton and Leatherby. I wish I'd been present, she said. A pretty woman can fool all the men in Christendom. Lies, probably. Maybe, John Quincy. But wait a minute. Later on, Chan and I followed up your newspaper clue, and it led us to a startling discovery. Or of course it did. What was it? Well, he said, first of all, I met a missionary on the boat.
He told her the Reverend Frank Upton's tale of that morning on Apiang, and added the news that a man named Thomas Mackenbraid was now in Honolulu.
She was silent for a time. So Dan was a blackbirder, she remarked at last. How charming. Such a pleasant man, too. But then I learned that lesson early in life. The brighter the smile, the darker the past. All this will make delightful reading in the Boston papers. John Quincy.
Oh, don't ever get it, her nephew said.
Don't deceive yourself. Newspapers will go to the ends of the earth for a good murder. I once wrote letters to all the editors in Boston, urging them to print no more details about homicides. It hadn't the slightest effect, though I did get an acknowledgement of my favor from the Herald. John Quincy glanced at his watch. Perhaps I should go down to the station. Anything in the morning paper. A very hazy interview with Captain Howett. The police have unearthed important clues and promise early results. You know, the sort of thing they always give out just after a murder. The boy looked at her keenly. Ah, he said. Then you read newspaper accounts of the kind you tried to suppress. Certainly I do. Snap his aunt. There's little enough excitement in my life, but I gladly gave up my port wine because I felt intoxicants were bad for the lower classes, and Haku interrupted with the news that John Quincy was wanted on the telephone. When the boy returned to the lanai, there was a brisk air of business about him. That was Charlie, he announced. The day's work is about to get underway. They've located Mr. and Mrs. Braid at the Riche and Palm Hotel, and I'm to meet Charlie there in 15 minutes. The Reef and Palm, repeated Miss Minerva. You see, it keeps coming back to Egan. I'd wager a set of Browning against a modern novel that he's the man who did it. You'd lose your Browning, and then where would you be when the lecture season started? Laughed John Quincy. I never knew you to be so stupid before. His face became serious. By the way, will you explain to Barbara that I can't join her after all? Miss Minerva nodding. Go along, she said. I envy you all this. First time in my life I ever wished I were a man. John Quincy approached the reef and palm by way of the beach. The scene was one of bright serenity. A few languid tourists lolled upon the sand. Others, more ambitious, were making picture postcard history out where the surf began. A great white steamer puffed blackly into port, standing in water up to their necks. A group of Hawaiian women paused in their search for luncheon delicacies to enjoy a moment's gossip. John Quincy passed Arlene Compton's cottage and entered the grounds of the Reef and Pond. On the beach not far from the hotel, an elderly Englishwoman sat on a camp stool with an easel and canvas before her. She was seeking to capture something of that exotic scene, vainly seeking for John Quincy. Glancing over her shoulder, perceived that her work was terrible. She turned and looked at him, a weary look of protest against his intrusion, and he was sorry she had caught him in the act of smiling at her. Chan had not yet arrived at the hotel, and the clerk informed John Quincy that Miss Carlotta had gone to the city. For that interview with her father, no doubt. He hoped that the evidence of the check would bring about Egan's release. It seemed to him that the man was being held on a rather flimsy pretext, anyhow. He sat down on the lanai at the side, where he could see both the path that led in from the street and the restless waters of the Pacific. On the beach, nearby, a man in a purple bathing suit reclined dejectedly, and John Quincy smiled in recollection. Mr. Saladin, alone with his tragedy, peering out at the waters that had robbed him, waiting, no doubt, for the tide to yield up its loot. Some 15 or 20 minutes passed, and then John Quincy heard voices in the garden. He saw that Howard and Chan were coming up the walk and went to meet them at the front door. "Splendid morning," said Chan. "Nice day to set out on new path, leading inevitably to important discovery." John Quincy accompanied them to the desk. The Japanese clerk regarded them with sullen unfriendliness. He had not forgotten the events of the day before. Information had to be dragged from him bit by bit. Yes, there was a Mr. and Mrs. Braid stopping there. They arrived last Saturday on the steamship Sonoma. Mr. Braid was not about at the moment. Mrs. Braid was on the beach, painting pretty pictures. "Good," said Howard. "I'll have a look around their room before I question them." "Take us there." The Jap hesitated. "Boy," he called. It was only a bluff. The Reef and Palm had no bellboys. Frankly, with an air of injured dignity, he led the way down a long corridor on the same floor as the office and unlocked the door of 19, the last room on the right. Hallett strode in and went to the window. "Here, wait a minute," he called to the clerk. He pointed to the elderly woman painting on the beach. "That Mrs. Braid?" "Yes, S," hissed the Jap. "All right, go along." The clerk went out. "Mr. Winterslip, I'll ask you to sit here in the window and keep an eye on the lady. If she starts to come in, let me know." He stared eagerly about the poorly furnished bedroom. "Now, Mr. Braid, I wonder what you've got." John Quincy took the post assigned him, feeling decidedly uncomfortable. This didn't seem quite honorable to him. However, he probably wouldn't be called upon to do any searching himself, and if policemen were forced to do disagreeable things, well, they should have thought of that before they became policemen. Not that either Howard or Chan appeared to be embarrassed by the task before them. There was a great deal of luggage in the room, English luggage, which is usually large and impressive. John Quincy noted a trunk, 2 enormous bags, and a smaller case. All were plastered with labels of the Sonoma, and beneath were the worn fragments of earlier labels, telling the broken story of other ships and far hotels. Howlett and Chan were old hands at this game. They went through Braid's chunk rapidly and thoroughly, but without finding anything of note. The captain turned his attention to the small traveling case. With every evidence of delight, he drew forth a packet of letters and sat down with them at a table. John Quincy was shocked. Reading other people's mail was in his eyes something that simply wasn't done. It was done by Howlett, however. In a moment, the captain spoke. Seems to have been in the British Civil Service in Calcutta, but he's resigned, he announced to Chan. Here's a letter from his superior in London, referring to Braid's 36 years on the job, and saying he's sorry to lose him. Howlett took up another letter. His face brightened as he read. Say, this is more like it. Say, he handed the typewritten page to Chan. The Chinaman looked at it, and his eyes sparkled. Most interesting, he cried, and turned it over to John Quincy. The boy hesitated. The standards of a lifetime are not easily abandoned, but the others had read it first, so he put aside his scruples. The letter was several months old and was addressed to Braid in Calcutta. Dear Sir, in reply to your inquiry of the 6th instant, would say that Mr. Daniel Winterslip is alive and is a resident of this city. His address is 3947 Kalia Road, Waikiki, Honolulu, TH. The signature was that of the British consul at Honolulu. John Quincy returned the epistle to Howlett, who put it in his pocket. At that instant, Chan, who had been exploring one of the larger bags, emitted a little grunt of satisfaction. What is it, Charlie? Howlett asked. The Chinaman set out on the table before his chief a small tin box and removed the lid. It was filled with cigarettes. Corsican brand, he announced cheerfully. Good, said Howlett. It begins to look as though Mr. Thomas McCann Braid would have a lot to explain. They continued their researches, while John Quincy sat silent by the window. Presently, Carlotta Egan appeared outside. She walked slowly to a chair on the lanai and sat down. For a moment, she stared at the breakers. Then, she began to weep. John Quincy turned uncomfortably away. It came to him that here, in this so-called paradise sorrow, was altogether too rampant. The only girls he knew were given to frequent tears, and not without reason. If you'll excuse me, he said. Howlett and Chan, searching avidly, made no reply, and climbing over the sill, he stepped onto the lanai. The girl looked up as he approached. Oh, she said, I thought I was alone. You'd like to be, perhaps, he answered, but it might help if you told me what has happened. Did you speak to your father about that check? She nodded. Yes, I showed it to him. And what do you think he did? He snatched it out of my hand and tore it into 100 pieces. He gave me the pieces to throw away. And he said I was never to mention it to a soul. I don't understand that, frowned John Quincy. Neither do I. He was simply furious, not like himself at all. And when I told him you knew about it, he lost his temper again. But you can rely on me. I shan't tell anyone. I know that. But of course, Father wasn't so sure of you as I am. Poor Dad. He's having a horrible time of it. They don't give him a moment's rest. Peep after him constantly, trying to make him tell. But all the policemen in the world couldn't, oh, poor old Dad. She was weeping again, and John Quincy felt towards her as he had felt toward Barbara. He wanted to put his arm about her, just by way of comfort and cheer. But alas, Carlota Maria Egan was not a Winterslip. Now, he said, that won't do a bit of good. She looked at him through her tears. Won't it? I don't know. It seems to help a little. But she dried her eyes. I really haven't time for it now. I must go in and see about lunch. She rose, and John Quincy walked with her along the balcony. I wouldn't worry if I were you, he said. The police are on an entirely new trail this morning. Really? She answered eagerly. Yes. There's a man named Braid stopping at your hotel. And you know him, I suppose. She shook her head. No, I don't. What?
He's a guest here.
He was. But he isn't here now. Wait a minute. John Quincy laid his hand on her arm and they stopped. This is interesting. Braid's gone, you say? Yes. I understand from the clerk that Mr. and Mrs. Braid arrived here last Saturday. But early Tuesday morning, before my boat got in, Mr. Braid disappeared, and he hasn't been seen since. Mr. Braid gets better all the time, John Quincy said. Next, Hawat and Chan are in his room now, and they've unearthed some rather intriguing facts. You'd better go in and tell Howard what you've just told me. They entered the lobby by a side door. As they did so, a slim, young Hawaiian boy was coming in through the big door at the front. Something in his manner caught the attention of John Quincy, and he stopped. At that instant, a purple bathing suit slipped by him, and Mr. Saladin also approached the desk. Carlota Egan went on down the corridor toward room 19, but John Quincy remained in the lobby. The Hawaiian boy moved rather diffidently toward the clerk. Excuse me, please, he said. I come to see Mr. Braid. Mr. Thomas Braid. Mr. Braid not here, replied the Jap. Then I will wait till he comes. The clerk frowned. No good. Mr. Braid, not in Honolulu now. Not in Honolulu. The Hawaiian seemed startled by the news. Mrs. Braid outside on the beach, continued the Jap. Oh, then Mr. Braid returns, said the boy with evident relief. I call again. He turned away, moving rapidly now. The clerk addressed Mr. Saladin, who was hovering near the cigar case. Yes, sir, please. Cigarettes, said the bereft Mr. Saladin. The Jap evidently knew the brand desired and handed over a box. You've put it on my bill, said Saladin. He stood for a moment, staring after the Hawaiian, who was disappearing through the front door. As he swung round, his eyes encountered those of John Quincy. He looked quickly away and hurried out. The two policemen and the girl entered from the corridor. Well, Mr. Winterslip, said Howard, the bird has flown. So I understand, John Quincy answered. But we'll find him, continued Howard. I'll go over these islands with the dragnet. First of all, I want to talk with his wife. He turned to Carlota Egan. Get her in here, he ordered. The girl looked at him. Please, he added. She motioned to the clerk, who went out the door. By the way, remarked John Quincy, someone was just here asking for Braid. What's that? Howlett was interested. A young Hawaiian about 20, I should say. Tall and slim. If you go to the door, you may catch a glimpse of him. Howlett hurried over and glanced out into the garden. In a second, he returned. He said, I know him. Did he say he'd come again? He did. Howlett considered. I've changed my mind, he announced. I won't question Mrs. Braid after all. For the present, I don't want her to know we're looking for her husband. I'll trust you to fix that up with your clerk, he added to the girl. She nodded. Lucky we left things as we found them in 19. Unless she misses that letter and the cigarettes, which isn't likely. We're all right. Now, Miss Egan, we three will go into your father's office there, behind the desk, and leave the door open. When Mrs. Braid comes in, I want you to question her about her husband's absence. Get all you can out of her. I'll be listening. I understand, the girl said. Howlett, Chan, and John Quincy went into Jim Egan's sanctum. You found nothing else in the room? The latter inquired of the Chinaman. Chan shook his head. Even so, fates are in smiling mood. What we have now are plentiful. Shh, warned Howlett. Mrs. Braid, a young man, was just here inquiring for your husband. It was Carlotta Egan's voice. Really? The accent was unmistakably British. He wanted to know where he could find him. We couldn't say. No, of course not. Your husband has left town, Mrs. Braid? Yes. I fancy he has. You know when he will return, perhaps? I really couldn't say. Is the mail in? Not yet. We expect it about 1. Thank you so much. Go to the door, Howlett directed John Quincy. She's gone to her room, announced the boy, and the three of them emerged from Egan's office. Oh, Captain, said the girl, I'm afraid I wasn't very successful. That's all right, replied Howlett. I didn't think you would be. The clerk was again at his post behind the desk. Howlett turned to him. Look here, he said. I understand someone was here a minute ago asking for Braid. It was Dick Kolowa, wasn't it? Yes, answered the Jap. Had he been here before to see Braid? Yes. Sunday night. Mr. Braid and him have long talk on the beach. Howlett nodded grimly. Come on, Charlie, he said. We've got our work cut out for us. Wherever Braid is, we must find him. John Quincy stepped forward. Pardon me, Captain, he remarked. But if you don't mind, just who is Dick Kalola? Howlett hesitated. Kalola's father, he's dead now, was a sort of confidential servant to Dan Winterslip. The boys, just plain no good. And oh yeah, so he's the grandson of that woman who's over at your place now. Kamai Kui. Is that her name? And Chapter 14, What Kola Carried. Several days slipped by so rapidly, John Quincy scarcely noted their passing. Dan Winterslip was sleeping now under the royal palms of the lovely island where he had been born. Sun and moon shone brightly in turn on his last dwelling place, but those who sought the person he had encountered that Monday night on his lanai were still groping in the dark. Howard had kept his word. He was combing the islands for Braid. But Braid was nowhere. Ships paused at the crossroads and sailed again. The name of Thomas McCann Braid was on no sailing list through far settlements that were called villages, but were nothing save clusters of Japanese huts and lonely coves where the surf moaned dismally over pineapple and sugar plantations. The emissaries of Howard pursued their quest. Their efforts came to nothing. John Quincy drifted idly with the days. He knew now the glamour of Waikiki waters. He had felt their warmth. Every afternoon, he experimented with a board in the Sukas Viennese surf, and he was eager for the moment when he could dare the big rollers farther out. Boston seemed like a tale that has told State Street and Beacon memories of another more active existence, now abandoned. No longer was he at a loss to understand his aunt's reluctance to depart these friendly shores. Early Friday afternoon, Miss Minerva found him reading a book on the lanai. Something in the nonchalance of his manner irritated her. She had always been for action, and the urge was on her, even in Hawaii. "Have you seen Mr. Chan lately?" when she inquired. "Talked with him this morning. They're doing their best to find Braid." "Hump," sniffed Miss Minerva. "Their best is none too good. I'd like to have a few Boston detectives on this case." "Oh, give them time," yawned John Quincy. "They've had 3 days," she sniffed. "Time enough. Braid never left this island of Oahu. That's certain. And when you consider that you can drive across it in a motor in 2 hours and around it in about 6, Mr. Howlett's brilliance does not impress. I'll have to end by solving this thing myself." John Quincy laughed. "Yes, maybe you will. Well, I've given them the 2 best clues they have. If they keep their eyes open the way I do." "Charlie's eyes are open," protested John Quincy. "Think so? They look pretty sleepy to me." Barbara appeared on the lanai, dressed for a drive. Her eyes were somewhat happier. A bit of color had come back to her cheeks. "What are you reading, John Quincy?" she asked. He held up the book. "The City by the Golden Gate," he told her. "Oh, really? If you're interested, I believe Dad had quite a library in San Francisco. I remember there was a history of the stock exchange. He wanted me to read it, but I couldn't." "You missed a good one," John Quincy informed her. "I finished it this morning. I've read 5 other books on San Francisco since I came." His aunt stared at him. "What for?" she asked. "Well," he hesitated. "I've taken sort of a fancy to the town. I don't know, sometimes I think I'd rather like to live there." Miss Minerva smiled grimly. "And they sent you out to take me back to Boston," she remarked. "Boston's all right," said her nephew, hastily. "It's Winterslip headquarters, but its hold has never been strong enough to prevent an occasional Winterslip from hitting the trail. You know, when I came into San Francisco Harbor, I had the oddest feeling." He told them about it, and the more I saw of the city, the better I liked it. There's a snap and sparkle in the air, and the people seem to know how to get the most out of life. Barbara smiled on him approvingly. "Follow that impulse, John Quincy," she advised. "Maybe I will. All this reminds me I must write a letter." He rose and left the lanai. Does he really intend to desert Boston? Barbara asked. Miss Minerva shook her head. Just a moment's madness, she explained. I'm glad he's going through it. He'll be more human in the future. But as for leaving Boston, John Quincy, as well, expect Bunker Hill Monument to emigrate to England. In his room upstairs, however, John Quincy's madness was persisting. He had never completed that letter to Agatha Parker, but he now plunged into his task with enthusiasm. San Francisco was his topic, and he wrote well. He pictured the city in words that glowed with life, and he wondered, just a suggestion, how she'd like to live there. Agatha was now, he recalled, on a ranch in Wyoming. Her first encounter with the West, and that was providential. She had felt for herself the lure of the wide open spaces. While the farther you went, the wider and opener they got. In California, life was all color and light. Just a suggestion, of course. As he sealed the flap of the envelope, he seemed to glimpse Agatha's thin patrician face, and his heart sank. Her gray eyes were cool, so different from Barbara's, so very different from those of Carlota Maria Egan. On Saturday afternoon, John Quincy had an engagement to play golf with Harry Jernison. He drove up Nuano Valley in Barbara's roadster. For Dan Winterslip's will had been read, and everything he possessed was Barbara's now. In that sheltered spot, a brisk rain was falling, as is usually the case, though the sun was shining brightly. John Quincy had grown accustomed to this phenomenon. Liquid sunshine the people of Hawaii cause such rain, and pay no attention to half a dozen different rainbows added to the beauty of the country club links. Jennison was waiting on the veranda, a striking figure in white. He appeared genuinely glad to see his guest, and they set out on a round of golf that John Quincy would long remember. Never before had he played amid such beauty. The low hills stood on guard, their slopes bright with tropical colors, the yellow of kukui trees, the gray of ferns, the emerald of ohia and banana trees, here and there a splotch of brick-red earth. The course was a green velvet carpet beneath their feet. The showers came and went. Jennison was a proficient driver, but the boy was his superior on approaches. And at the end of the match, John Quincy was 4 up. They putted through a rainbow and returned to the locker room. In the roadster going home, Jennison brought up the subject of Dan Winterslip's murder. John Quincy was interested to get the reaction of a lawyer to the evidence. I've kept more or less in touch with the case, Jennison said. Egan is still my choice. Somehow, John Quincy resented this. A picture of Carlota Egan's lovely but unhappy face flashed through his mind. How about Leatherby and the Compton woman? He asked. Well, of course, I wasn't present when they told their story, Jennison replied. But Hallett claims it sounded perfectly plausible, and it doesn't seem likely that if he'd had anything to do with the murder, Leatherby would have been fool enough to keep that page from the desk book. There's Braid, too, John Quincy suggested. Yes, Braid complicates things. But when they run him down, if they do, I imagine the result will be nil. You know that Kamaikui's grandson is mixed up somehow with Braid. So I understand. It's a matter that wants looking into. But mark my words, when all these trails are followed to the end, everything will come back to Jim Egan. What have you against Egan? Inquired John Quincy, swerving to avoid another car. I have nothing against Egan, Jennison replied, but I can't forget the look on Dan Winterslip's face that day. He told me he was afraid of the man. Then there is the stub of the Corsican cigarette. Most important of all, Egan's silence regarding his business with Winterslip. Men who are facing a charge of murder, my boy, talk, and talk fast. Unless it so happens that what they have to say would further incriminate them, they drove on and silence into the heart of the city. Holly tells me you're doing a little detective work yourself, smiled Jennison. Jennison, I've tried, but I'm a duffer, John Quincy admitted. Just at present, my efforts consist of a still hunt for that watch Aunt Minerva saw on the murderer's wrist. Whenever I see a wristwatch, I get as close to it as I can and stare. But as most of my sleuthing is done in the daytime, it isn't so easy to determine whether the numeral 2 is bright or dim. Persistence, urged Jennison. That's the secret of a good detective. Stick to the job, and you may succeed yet. The lawyer was to dine with the family at Waikiki. John Quincy set him down at his office, where he had a few letters to sign, and then drove him out to the beach. Barbara was gowned in white. She was slim and wistful and beautiful. And considering the events of the immediate past, the dinner was a cheerful one. They had coffee on the lanai. Presently, Jennison rose and stood by Barbara's chair. We've something to tell you, he announced. He looked down at the girl. Is that right, my dear? Barbara nodded. Your cousin and I, the lawyer turned to the two from Boston, have been fond of each other for a long time. We shall be married very quietly in a week or so.
Oh, Harry, not a week, said Barbara.
Well, as you wish. But very soon. Yes, very soon, she repeated. And leave Honolulu for a time, Jennison continued. Naturally, Barbara feels she cannot stay here for the present. So many memories. You both understand. She has authorized me to put this house up for sale. But Harry, Barbara protested, you make me sound so inhospitable. Telling my guests that the house is for sale and I am leaving. Nonsense, my dear, said Aunt Minerva. John Quincy and I understand quite. I sympathize with your desire to get away. She rose. I'm sorry, said Jennison. I did sound a little abrupt, but I'm naturally eager to take care of her now. Of course, John Quincy agreed. Miss Minerva bent over and kissed the girl. If your mother were here, dear child, she said, she couldn't wish for your happiness any more keenly than I do. Barbara reached up impulsively and put her arms about the older woman. John Quincy shook Jennison's hand. You're mighty lucky. I think so, Jennison answered. The boy went over to Barbara. All good wishes, he said. She nodded, but did not reply. He saw there were tears in her eyes. Presently, Miss Minerva withdrew to the living room, and John Quincy, feeling like a fifth wheel, made haste to leave the two together. He went out on the beach. The pale moon rode high amid the golden stars. Romance whispered through the coconut palms. He thought of the scene that he had witnessed that breathless night on the President Tyler. Only two in the world, Love quick and overwhelming. Well, this was the setting for it. Here on this beach, they had walked 2 and 2 since the beginning of time, whispering the same vows, making the same promises, whatever their color and creed. Suddenly, the boy felt lonely. Barbara was a Winterslip, and not for him. Why then did he feel again that frustrated pang in his heart? She had chosen, and her choice was fitting. What affair was it of his? He found himself moving slowly toward the Reef and Palm Hotel for a chat with Carlota Egan. But why should he want to talk with this girl, whose outlook was so different from that of the world he knew? The girls at home were on a level with the men in brains. Often, indeed. They were superior, seemed to be looking down from a great height. They discussed that article in the latest Atlantic, Shaw's Grim Philosophy, the new sergeant at the art gallery. Wasn't that the sort of talk you should be seeking here? Or was it? Under these palms on this romantic beach, with the moon riding high over Diamond Head, Carlota Egan was seated behind the desk in the deserted lobby of the Reef and Palm, a worried frown on her face. "You've come at the psychological moment," she cried and smiled. "I'm having the most awful struggle." "Arithmetic," John Quincy inquired. "Compound fractions, it seems to me. I'm making out the Braid's bill." He came round the desk and stood at her side. "Let me help you. It's so fearfully involved." She looked up at him, and he wished they could do their sums on the beach. "Mr. Braid has been away since Tuesday morning, and we don't charge for any absence of more than 3 days. So that comes out of it. Maybe you can figure it. I can't." "Charge him anyhow," suggested John Quincy. "I'd like to. That would simplify everything. But it's not Dad's way." John Quincy took up a pencil. "What rate are they paying?" he inquired. She told him, and he began to figure. It wasn't a simple matter, even for a bond expert. John Quincy frowned too. Someone entered the front door of the Reef and Palm. Looking up, John Quincy beheld the Hawaiian boy, Dick Kaula. He carried a bulky object, wrapped in newspapers. "Mr. Braid here now?" he asked. Carlota Egan shook her head. "No, he hasn't returned." "I will wait," said the boy. "But we don't know where he is or when he will come back," the girl protested. "He will be here soon," the Hawaiian replied. "I wait on the lanai." He went out the side door, still carrying his clumsy burden. John Quincy and the girl stared at each other. "We move, we advance," John Quincy quoted in a low voice. "Braid will be here soon. Would you mind going out on the lanai and telling me where Kaula is now?" Quickly, the girl complied. She returned in a few seconds. "He's taken a chair at the far end." "Out of earshot?" "Quite." "You want the telephone close to—" But John Quincy was already in the booth. Charlie Chan's voice came back over the wire. "Most warm congratulations. You are #1 detective yourself. Should my self-starter not indulge in stubborn spasm, I will make immediate connection with you." John Quincy returned to the desk, smiling. "Charlie's flying to us in his Ford. Begins to look as though we were getting somewhere. Now, but about this bill, Mrs. Braid's board and room, I make $16. The charge against Mr. Braid. 1 week's board and room, minus 4 days board, totals $9.62. How can I ever thank you? Said the girl, by telling me again about your childhood on this beat. A shadow crossed her face. Oh, I'm sorry. I've made you unhappy. Oh no, you couldn't. She shook her head. I've never been so very happy. Always an if in it, as I told you before. That morning on the ferry, I think I was nearest to real happiness. I seemed to have escaped from life for a moment. I remember how you laughed at my hat. Oh, I hope you've forgiven me. Nonsense. I'm mighty glad I was able to make you laugh like that. Her great eyes stared into the future, and John Quincy pitied her. He had known others like her, others who loved their fathers, built high hopes for them, then saw them drift into a baffled old age. One of the girl's slender, tanned hands lay on the desk. John Quincy put his own upon it. Don't be unhappy, he urged. It's such a wonderful night. The moon, what you may call it a kamina, I know. But I'll bet you never saw the moon looking so well before. It's like $1,000 gold piece, pale, but negotiable. Shall we go out and spend it? Gently, she drew her hand away. There were 7 bottles of charged water sent to the room. 35 cents each. What? Oh, the Braid's bill. Yes, that means $2.45 more. I'd like to mention the stars too. Isn't it odd how close the stars seem in the tropics? She smiled. We mustn't forget the trunks and bags. $3 for bringing them up from the dock. Say, that's rather steep. Well, it goes down on the record. Have I ever told you that all this natural beauty out here has left its imprint on your face? In the midst of so much loveliness, one couldn't be anything but it plans to burrs. Mrs. Braid had 3 trays to the room. That's 75 cents more.
Extravagant lady.
Braid will be sorry he came back for more reasons than one. Well, I've got that. Anything else? Just the laundry. 97 cents. Fair enough. Adding it all up, I get $32.69. Let's call it an even 33. She laughed. Oh no. We can't do that. Mrs. Braid came slowly into the lobby from the Wannan. She paused at the desk. Has there been a message? Swelling spring, some parrot. No, Mrs. Braid, the girl answered. She handed over the slip of paper. Your bill. Yes. Mr. Braid will attend to this the moment he returns. You expect him soon? I really can't say. The Englishwoman moved on into the corridor leading to 19. Full of information, as usual, smiled John Quincy. Why, here's Charlie now. Chan came briskly to the desk, followed by another policeman. Also, in plain clothes. Automobile act noble, he announced, having fondly feeling for night air. He nodded toward his companion, introducing Mr. Spencer. Now, what are the situation? Humbly hinting you, speak fast. John Quincy told him Calla was waiting on the lanai and mentioned the unwieldy package carried by the boy. Chan nodded. Events are turning over rapidly, he said. He addressed the girl. Please kindly relate to this Calla that Braid has arrived and would wish to encounter him here. She hesitated. No, added Chan hastily. I forget nice heathen delicacy. It is not pretty. I should ask a lady to scatter false lies from ruby lips. I humbly demand forgiveness. Content yourself with a veiled pretext bringing him here. The girl smiled and went out. Mr. Spencer, said Chan, I make bold to suggest you interrogate this Hawaiian. My reckless wanderings among words of unlimitable English language often fail to penetrate sort of skulls plentiful round here. Spencer nodded and went to the side door, standing where he would not be seen by anyone entering. In a moment, Calla appeared, followed by the girl. The Hawaiian came in quickly, but seeing Chan, stopped, and a frightened look crossed his face. Spencer startled him further by seizing his arm. Come over here, said the detective. We want to talk to you. He led the boy to a far corner of the room. Chan and John Quincy followed. Sit down. Here, I'll take that. He removed the heavy package from under the boy's arm. For a moment, the Hawaiian seemed about to protest, but evidently she thought better of it. Spencer placed the package on a table and stood over Calla. Want to see Braid, eh? He began in a threatening tone. Yes. What for? Business is private. Well, I'm telling you, to come across. You're in bad. Better change your mind? And talk? No. All right. We'll see about that. What have you got in that package? Package shows it. Now, the boy's eyes went to the table, but he made no answer. Chan took out a pocket knife. Simple matter to discover, he said. He cut the rough twine, unwound several layers of newspapers. John Quincy pressed close. He felt that something important was about to be divulged. The last layer of paper came off. Ha, to dog, cried Chan. He turned quickly to John Quincy. Oh, I am so sorry. I pick up atrocious phrase like that from my cousin Mr. Willie Chan, captain of all Chinese baseball team. But John Quincy did not hear. His eyes were glued to the object that lay on the table. An Ohio wood box, bound with copper. The initials TMB. We will unlatch it, said Chan. He made an examination. No, locked most strongly. We will crash into it at police station, where you and I, and this silent Hawaiian, will now hasten. Mr. Spencer, you will remain on spot. Here. Should Braid appear, you know your duty. I do, said Spencer. Mr. Calla, do me the honor to accompany, continued Chan. At police headquarters, much talk will be extracted out of you. They turned toward the door. As they did so, Carlotta Egan came up. May I speak to you a moment? She said to John Quincy. Surely. He walked with her to the desk. I went to the lanai just now. She whispered breathlessly. Someone was crouching outside the window near where you were talking. I went closer and it was Saladin. Aha, said John Quincy. Mr. Saladin had better drop that sort of thing, or he'll get himself in trouble. Should we tell Chan? Not yet. You and I, We'll do a little investigating ourselves first. Chan has other things to think about. And we don't want any of our guests to leave unless it's absolutely necessary. We certainly don't, she smiled. I'm glad you've got the interests of the house at heart. That's just where I've got them, John Quincy began. The Chan cut in. Humbly begging pardon, he said. We must speed. Captain Hallett will have high delight to encounter this kala, to say nothing of Ohio woodbucks. In the doorway, Kawala crowded close to John Quincy, and the latter was startled by the look of hate he saw in the boy's stormy eyes. You did this, muttered the Hawaiian. I don't forget.